Welcome back, brothers, to Warhammer. Tonight's story, we're diving into the unknown lore of Space Marine 3. As always, before we get to the madness, be sure to like and comment on videos and topics you want to see in the future. And be sure to subscribe for the Emperor. I want to thank you guys for the support. You have been killing it. Now, let's get to the video.
The dead came back through the embarkation deck before the living were permitted to leave it. Servitors dragged the black-shrouded remains of Voidsmen and Auxilia beneath the lowered wings of Thunderhawks, their augmetic feet clanging on deck plates filmed with hydraulic oil, blood, and the grey paste left when living metal had been reduced beneath melter fire. Armourers waited beside open racks of ceramite, scraping dried gore from pauldrons with hooked tools and burning metallic residue from damaged greaves beneath blue-white arcs. An apothecary stood among them, with one gauntlet sunk into the open chest cavity of a fallen battle-brother, his narthecium working with obscene precision as it removed the progenoid glands from the corpse. No prayer was wasted on the shell that remained. The gene seed was placed inside a stasis casket. The casket was sealed, and another name passed from warrior to legacy. Captain Demetrian Titus watched it all from beneath the vaulted armor glass of the Righteous Fury's principal embarkation deck. His own armor bore fresh scars beneath new heraldry. The blue plate of the Ultramarines scored white, where alien blades had reached the ceramite, but failed to reach the flesh beneath. The iron halo mounted behind his gorget caught the lumen glow like a crown, fashioned for a war god, while his master-crafted chainsword rested mag-locked against his thigh, its teeth cleaned, but not yet blessed by the armorium. Around him, men spoke of victory. Titus saw only maintenance. A servitor passed bearing 3 severed arms in a steel recovery tray. One still wore the blackened remains of an Imperial Navy glove. Another was too large to have belonged to an unaugmented man and ended above the elbow in torn bundles of transhuman muscle and severed fiber bundles from a Space Marine's armor. Titus followed it with his eyes until the tray vanished beyond the apothecarian doors. There had been a time, centuries ago, when triumph had possessed a shape distinct from survival. He remembered standards lifted above conquered walls, brothers striking fists to breastplates, mortal soldiers weeping merely to see an angel of death walk among them. The centuries had pared such distinctions away. Worlds were reclaimed so that other worlds could be lost more slowly. Fortresses were taken because ammunition had to pass through them. Men died so that armies might arrive somewhere else and kill more efficiently. The Imperium did not win wars. It postponed extinction, one butchered generation at a time. Behind Titus, the adamantine doors opened with a hydraulic growl. Ancient Gadriel entered carrying the standard of the Second Company furled beneath a protective sheath. His armor had been repaired, but deep scoring remained across his left vambrace. "Captain," he said. Titus turned. Gadriel continued, "Astropath Cornelius requests your presence in the Strategium. Immediate priority. Commodore Silver has already been summoned." Titus looked once more across the embarkation deck. "Then the dead may wait without us." Dinal Cornelius had bled through the bandages covering his eyes. The astropath stood at the edge of the Strategium dais, with one hand clenched around the iron head of his staff, crimson leaking through the cloth and tracing narrow lines down his cheeks. Servo skulls drifted around him, bearing purity seals, incense burners, and diagnostic auspexes, whose chimes were almost lost beneath the low growl of the ship's plasma drives. Above the central hololithic table hung 3 spheres of cold light, each representing an imperial world, each pulsing with the same crimson distress sigil. Commodore Gaius Silver stood beneath them in a long void black coat, silver rank chains lying across the breast. Veteran Sergeant Mataris occupied the shadows behind him, helmet beneath one arm, his weathered face turned not toward Cornelius, but toward Titus. 3 emergency transmissions, Silver said. Mordain Prime, the industrial moon Helicon Secundus, and the agri-world Vanek. The signals entered the astropathic relay within moments of one another. Titus regarded the worlds. Distance between origins? Silver's jaw tightened. Millions of kilometers. Cornelius gave a humorless rasp. Too far for conventional coordination, too precise for coincidence. Something touched them together. He raised a trembling hand. You should hear it. The Strategium speakers awakened in a wash of screaming static. Men shouted over detonations, vox distortion, and the thunder of weapons. A priest's voice rose above everything else, roaring a catechism to the emperor until the words vanished beneath a shriek like tearing metal amplified through cathedral pipes. Titus knew that sound. Gauss discharge. Another voice cut through, disciplined at first, an officer attempting to report through panic. Western Bastion breached. Emperor preserve us. They are inside the defense galleries. They are not taking prisoners. They are not taking anything. Throne, what is that? Automatic fire hammered in the background. Someone screamed for ammunition. Then came the officer again, his composure gone. Sergeant Maller has been struck. Armor is Emperor's blood. His armor is coming apart, flesh beneath it. I can see the muscle stripping from the bone. He is still standing. He is still... The transmission became a burst of electrical violence. For an instant, another voice appeared, whispering a prayer so quickly the words blurred together, and then silence. Cornelius closed his fist. The recording stopped. Gadriel stared at the dead Vox channel. Necrons. Yes, Titus said. Silver touched the hololithic controls, and the three worlds multiplied into an entire system. Mordain Prime swelled above them, a hive world wrapped in orbital docks and defense stations. Helicon Primus and Helicon Secundus appeared as industrial moons scarred by manufactoria and strip mines. Beyond them revolved Vanek, green beneath bands of cloud, its agricultural continents marked by export routes spreading into neighboring systems. More sigils ignited, naval anchorages, troop depots, munitions reserves, fuel refineries, astropathic stations, munition silos. Silver spoke while the tactical display expanded. Mordain Prime maintains population levies and defense formations numbering in the hundreds of millions. Vanek provides grain and protein allotments to 9 surrounding systems, including 3 active fronts supporting the reclamation. Helicon's manufactoria produce armor plate, macro shell casings, reactor components, and replacement track assemblies. If the Reach falls, the consequences will not remain inside the Reach. He magnified lines of supply until they resembled veins around a diseased organ. Within months, ration reductions. Within a year, ammunition shortfalls. Thereafter, operational collapse on fronts that have never heard the name Mordain. Matoris finally looked toward the display. Then Mordain is not the target. Silver frowned. Explain. Titus answered for him. It is a throat. The enemy means to close its hand around it. Additional reports scrolled across the hololith. Necron formations had emerged beneath population centers with little attempt to secure infrastructure. Destroyer constructs had bypassed fortified targets to pursue fleeing civilian columns. On Helicon Secundus, dynastic warriors had opened fire upon their own Canoptech servants before assaulting an imperial refinery that held no strategic value. Another fragment described Necron nobles ordering disciplined withdrawal only for destroyer cults to turn upon their accompanying phalanxes. Gadriel read the reports in silence before saying, "Disunity." Titus shook his head. "Infection." Mataris's gaze settled upon him. The old warrior had worn the colors of Ultramar before Titus had possessed his first combat blade. He knew the answer before the name was spoken. "Amantar," he said. The Strategium seemed colder. Silver looked between them. "You are certain?" "No," Titus replied. "Certainty is a luxury granted after the enemy is dead. But the pattern fits. Destroyers abandoning logic, dynastic command breaking down, killing without military purpose." He studied the glowing roots converging upon Mordain Prime. Amantar is moving towards something. Gadriel rested one gauntleted hand upon the sheathed company standard. Then we find what it wants. Titus looked at him. Before it possesses it. Silver dismissed several tactical windows and replaced them with fleet readiness projections. 2 defense flotillas can reinforce us if we delay translation. One from the Galath Belt, another from the Eastern Cordon. 30 hours, perhaps less. No, Titus said. Silver had commanded Void War longer than most mortal men lived, and he did not retreat from disagreement merely because a space marine stood before him. Captain, the force presently available is insufficient for a deliberate assault against a fully awakened Necron system. Then we will not permit it to awaken fully. 30 hours gives us another 3 cruisers, 9 escorts, and additional troop capacity. 30 hours gives the Xenos the same 30 hours. Silver's expression hardened. And stripping the Galath Belt leaves 4 reclaimed worlds, dependent upon static defense monitors and planetary batteries. Titus turned toward him. Defending everything equally is another method of losing everything slowly. The Commodore was silent. Titus continued, "Issue immediate translation orders. All vessels capable of combat deployment will form on the Righteous Fury. Any ship unable to make readiness before departure remains behind. There will be protests from Sector Command. They may file them after Mordain survives." Within an hour, the fleet began gathering around the battle barge. Strike cruisers slid from anchorages with engine wakes burning like miniature suns. Defense monitors maneuvered from orbital stations under clouds of maneuvering thrusters. Troop ships arrived bloated with soldiers and vehicles, their hulls painted with regimental markings, devotional script, and the scars of wars no archivist had bothered to record. Ammunition hulks moved among them, like iron cathedrals without windows, carrying macro shells, bolter ammunition, promethium, plasma cells, and enough explosives to erase cities. Mechanicus tenders followed beneath red identification beacons, their holds crowded with replacement components, servitors, tracked recovery engines, and solemn adepts entrusted with coaxing wounded machine spirits back toward function. Hospital vessels joined the procession, chapel decks already prepared for the dying. Mass conveyors several kilometers long brought replacement infantry, engineering companies, fuel bladders, ration blocks, and the paper-bound bureaucracy without which the Imperium could not wage war. Tens of thousands labored aboard the Righteous Fury alone. Across the assembled fleet, the number climbed into the millions. The Adeptus Astartes stood at the point of the blade, but the blade was useless without the colossal, suffering body behind it. Translation came beneath prayer. Geller fields rose to full strength. Tech priests anointed control consoles with sacred oils, while bridge officers recited departure catechisms learned from officers who had recited them 10,000 years before. Then the fleet passed into the Empyrean. Hours became unreliable. Clocks disagreed. Servitors spoke words no command had entered into them and were destroyed by their overseers. Titus spent the passage reviewing casualty projections until the warning klaxons called him to the bridge. The Righteous Fury had returned to real space earlier than intended. Ahead drifted an Imperial transport, engines dead, running lights dark. Its hull designation identified it as the St. Jeromiel, a civilian evacuation vessel registered to Mordain. At first, Titus thought frost coated its embarkation ports. Magnification proved otherwise. Bodies covered the hull. Men had crawled from ruptured compartments into vacuum and frozen where their dying hands found purchase. Others remained jammed inside blown airlocks, arms extended as though the void itself had dragged them outward. Silver reported, "Auspex detects several thousand life signs." A pause. "And additional movement patterns inconsistent with human physiology." Titus was already turning from the bridge. "Prepare a boarding craft." The St. Jeromiel smelled of blood, even through armor filtration. Titus entered through a breached embarkation lock with Gadriel and 10 intercessors behind him, bolt rifles tracking across a corridor whose devotional murals had disappeared beneath handprints and arterial spray. Refugees crouched behind overturned cargo pallets. Some began praying when they saw blue armor. Others merely stared. The first corpse hung from an overhead pipe, with its skin removed from throat to ankles. The second had been opened across the abdomen and emptied, its organs dragged along the deck in a dark rope. Titus raised one fist. The squad halted. Something moved behind the bodies. A shape unfolded from the shadows, wearing strips of human flesh across a skeletal frame of tarnished metal. The flayed one screamed through a mouth that had never possessed lungs. Titus fired once. The bolt struck beneath its collar assembly, penetrated, then detonated. Living metal burst outward in incandescent fragments, the shock throwing wet ribbons of stolen skin across the shrine wall. The corridor became slaughter. Flayed ones erupted from ventilation ducts, ceiling recesses, and piles of corpses where they had lain motionless beneath their grisly trophies. Bolt rifles thundered in disciplined sequence, mass reactive shells punching into metal bodies before exploding them from within. One creature reached an intercessor and dragged hooked claws across his breastplate, carving furrows through ceramite. Gadriel smashed the thing aside with his shoulder and emptied 3 rounds through its torso at arm's length. Titus drew his chainsword. The weapon awakened with a predatory roar. A flayed one lunged. Titus caught its wrist, crushed the joint in his gauntlet, and drove the chainsword up beneath its rib-like thorax. Adamantine teeth tore through necrodermis and internal mechanisms, spraying molten droplets and strips of rotting human tissue across his armor. Another came low. He stepped into it, broke its spine across his knee, and stamped through its skull before resurrection protocols could begin repairing the damage. Around them, refugees screamed and crawled through the blood. No Space Marine answered them. The Ultramarines killed until nothing remained moving, except those they had come to save. Then the Auspex changed. Green runes pulsed beneath the human life signs. Dimensional anomalies. Multiple. Gadriel saw them at the same moment. Translocation signatures. Titus looked toward the sealed compartments deeper in the ship. Thousands remained there. So did the enemy. Begin evacuation of cleared compartments. Gadriel hesitated for less than a heartbeat. And the others? Remain sealed. There are still survivors beyond Bulkhead 27. There are also Necron translation signatures beyond Bulkhead 27. Titus sheathed the chainsword. We do not bring an enemy beacon into formation. They evacuated whom they could, not whom they wanted. Thunderhawks carried screaming civilians back toward the fleet, while the St. Jeromiel drifted between the stars, with thousands still trapped aboard. Once the last cleared compartment had been emptied, Titus returned to the Righteous Fury's bridge. Vox traffic from the transport filled the command deck. Men pleaded. Priests demanded salvation in the Emperor's name. Someone begged them not to leave the children in the lower holds. Silver looked toward Titus without speaking. "Target the transport," Titus said. "Lance batteries ready," came the reply. Gadriel stood beside him, helmet beneath one arm, expression carved from stone. The cries continued until Titus said, "Mute the channel." Silence fell. "Fire!" White light consumed the St. Jeromiel. For an instant, the transport became a perfect burning skeleton of its former shape. Then the lance strike tore through its reactor decks, and the vessel vanished inside expanding plasma. Debris scattered into the dark. Gadriel watched until nothing remained large enough to resemble a ship. He did not question the order. That troubled him more than if he had. Cornelius arrived after the firing, leaning upon his staff, fresh blood darkening the cloth over his ruined eyes. "You felt something," Titus said. The astropath's mouth twisted. Felt is not the word. He approached the viewing ports as though blind eyes could perceive what waited beyond them. There is no presence in the warp, no demon, no hunger, No laughter behind the veil, nothing with a soul. His fingers tightened around the staff. That is worse. Silva glanced toward him. Explain. Cornelius exhaled. The immaterium recoils around the Mordain Reach, not from corruption, from absence. Something there does not belong to the warp, because it does not require the warp. It is cold, ordered, mathematical. Reality around it feels... He searched for a word and failed. Owned. The warning came seconds later. Translation alarms rolled across the bridge. The stars twisted, died, and returned. The righteous fury emerged into the Mordain Reach beneath a sky already at war. Mordain Prime burned ahead, its night side scarred by continent-spanning fires visible from orbit. To port, a dead moon split open. Cracks, thousands of kilometers long, blazed emerald through the crust. Mountain chains sheared away into space. Vast geometries rose from beneath the broken mantle, black metal structures unfolding where no structure should have survived for geological ages. Then the warships came. They lifted from within the moon one after another, crescent hulls cutting through clouds of planetary debris, engines silent, weapons waking in lines of poisonous green. Imperial Auspex screens filled with hostile returns faster than bridge servitors could classify them. Commodore Silva studied the impossible count. When he spoke, his voice was almost gentle. Enemy fleet strength approaching 4 vessels to every one of ours. Titus stared through the armor glass as the first Necron ships turned toward them. Mordain Prime burned beyond their silhouettes. Somewhere beneath those fires, something ancient was waking. All stations, Titus said. His voice carried across the bridge, then through the Voxnet to every deck and every ship still listening. Battle stations. The first Imperial broadside crossed the void before the battle barge had completed its emergence from translation. Macro batteries fired in sequence along the flanks of the righteous fury, each weapon hurling shells so immense that lesser vessels could have hidden behind them, their drives burning white as they crossed the darkness toward the Necron formation. The recoil rolled through the battle barge in deep metallic thunder, shaking dust from shrine alcoves and setting chains of devotional script trembling against bulkheads. Lance batteries followed, pillars of coherent light cutting across thousands of kilometers and striking the leading crescent vessel with enough force to turn armor into incandescent vapor. For a heartbeat, the enemy ship vanished behind a blossom of molten debris, and then it emerged again, wounded but intact, its black hull knitting together around the scar. Imperial escorts surged ahead in attack formation, torpedoes spilling from launch tubes beneath clouds of defensive fire. One frigate died before its first spread reached the enemy. Green light touched its prow without warning. Armor peeled away in glowing sheets, internal decks exposed one after another, as if some invisible hand were stripping flesh from bone. The vessel broke amidships. Atmosphere erupted in silver clouds filled with men, ammunition crates and spinning pieces of machinery. Seconds later, another escort vanished beneath a line of emerald fire so bright that shadows leapt across the bridge of the righteous fury. Commodore Gaius Silva watched the destruction through overlapping hololithic displays without raising his voice. Starboard screen is collapsing. Order the valiant oath to close the gap. Defense monitors are to maintain torpedo saturation on the central crescent formation. Do not pursue damaged contacts. They want us drawn apart. Titus stood beside the command throne, helmet sealed, the red lenses of his battle plate reflecting the system's burning moon. They want us stopped, he said. The difference matters. The Necrons did not fight like any human navy. Imperial vessels maneuvered according to inertia, firing solutions, projected trajectories, and the slow violence of mass driven across immense distances. The Xenos seemed to regard such principles as inconveniences. Their ships altered course with impossible precision, sliding aside from torpedoes that should have struck, rotating without visible thrusters, and appearing where auger crews swore no vessel had existed moments earlier. Green arcs crawled across void shields and devoured them layer by layer. One defense monitor lost its prow, then half its weapons decks, before a second strike cut it through the reactor spine. Silver did not watch the casualty runes bloom across his display. Maintain the corridor toward Mordain Prime. An officer replied that the enemy was concentrating ships directly in their path. Then let them, Silver said. Every vessel they place before us is one less vessel elsewhere. Titus studied the tactical map. The Imperial fleet could not win a contest of attrition. It did not possess the ships, the time, or the industrial reserve to grind down a Necron force already repairing damage that would have crippled a human cruiser. The battle barge could kill, but killing was not the objective. He enlarged the fractured moon. Beneath the shattered crust, hidden structures glowed with pulsing energy, and every major Necron interception course intersected around one fortress embedded deep inside the exposed mantle. There, Titus said. Silver turned. The moon installation? It controls their interception network. An assumption. A pattern. Titus traced the routes with one gauntleted finger. Their vessels reposition whenever those emitters pulse. Destroy the node, and their coordination degrades. Silver studied the feed for several seconds. A conventional bombardment would require us to close inside their strongest fire arc. Then we will not bombard it conventionally. The order spread through the battle barge before the bridge crew finished acknowledging it. Armory klaxons sounded. Drop pod clamps unlocked. Thunderhawk engines screamed to life in the embarkation decks. The second company moved with the economy of warriors who had rehearsed planetary assault for centuries. No speech was required. Squad leaders confirmed ammunition stocks. Apothecaries checked gene seed recovery canisters. Tech Marines assigned demolition charges and boarding cutters, and servitors loaded fresh magazines into weapon racks, while machine spirits were invoked beneath clouds of incense. Gadriel entered the embarkation bay beneath the weight of the company standard, its cloth furled and sealed for descent. He found Titus already locking his master-crafted chainsword against his thigh. "The mortal fleet holds the Xenos in the void," Gadriel said. "And we remove the organ directing them," Titus replied. Gadriel glanced toward the open drop pod racks. Classical doctrine. Classical doctrine survives because the dead continue proving it correct. Around them, armored warriors entered their capsules. Heavy restraints locked across breastplates. Titus stepped into his own pod. "The fleet does not need victory," he said. "It needs a wound large enough to pass through." The pod doors closed. Launch threw him downward with such violence that an unaugmented man would have broken against the restraints. The world became impact, alarms and the shriek of atmospheric friction. The fractured moon rotated beneath them, its exposed interior blazing with emerald lines, defense towers rising from broken continental shelves like black needles. Drop pods fell in clusters, retros screaming, their hulls glowing red beneath anti-aircraft fire. One vanished when a beam passed through it and continued on into space. Another took a direct hit and broke apart, fragments tumbling away with the bodies of space marines still locked inside. A Thunderhawk lost its port wing and cartwheeled into a defense tower, the resulting explosion tearing a crater through the structure. Titus watched through flickering tactical runes as the surviving pods corrected course. His impact came hard enough to fracture the rock beneath them. Restraints released, explosive bolts fired. The doors slammed outward into a storm of Gauss fire. Titus moved before the dust had cleared. His heavy bolt pistol barked once, twice, 3 times. The first shell struck a Necron warrior in the chest and exploded inside the ribbed cage, throwing half the construct backward in fragments. The second took another through the throat assembly. The third broke a leg joint and sent the machine crashing to one knee. Titus was already upon it. His chainsword roared alive and descended through the neck. Adamantine teeth caught, screamed and tore through living metal. Green fire spat from the wound. The warrior's head struck the ground, still burning. Around him, intercessors emerged from their pods and established disciplined firing arcs. Bolt rifles hammered into advancing ranks. Each detonation threw pieces of ancient metal across the black stone. The Necrons answered with silence. No battle cry, no fear. Gauss flares rose in perfect unison, and the air filled with green death. Titus saw a defense auxiliary trooper caught in the edge of a beam as the first human landing craft reached the perimeter. The man's breastplate vanished. Cloth disappeared beneath it, then skin, then the red anatomy of muscle. He had time to scream once before the flesh of his chest peeled away in luminous strips. His ribs blackened, became translucent, then ceased to exist. What remained of him fell as ash before touching the ground. Astartes' plate endured where mortal armor did not, but endurance was not immunity. Gauss, fire crawled across ceramite and left pits that smoked through protective coatings. A battle brother beside Gadriel took a sustained burst across his left shoulder. Blue plate vanished by layers, heraldry and armor alike stripped down to exposed fiber bundles before the Marine twisted behind cover. "Armor breached," he reported, voice flat. Gadriel fired over the barricade and reduced the warrior responsible to fragments. Titus crossed the killing ground at a pace that would have seemed impossible for something so massive. Hundreds of kilograms of ceramite, reinforced bone, and transhuman muscle moved with the speed of a charging predator. He reached the Necron firing line before the next volley settled. His shoulder struck one warrior hard enough to fold it backward. The chainsword tore through another at the waist. He seized a third by the skull, dragged it into the path of incoming gorse fire, and released the remains only when the machine's torso began disintegrating in his grasp. "Advance," Titus ordered. The second company advanced. The first destroyers came through the barricades without warning. Skorpek constructs smashed aside shattered masonry and dead warriors alike, their bladed limbs burning with cold light. An intercessor fired into one at close range, shells exploding across its thorax. But the machine continued forward and carved him from collar to hip. Ceramite split. Blood struck the rock in a steaming arc. The Marine fell in two pieces, while the destroyer was already turning toward another target. Ophidian forms erupted from beneath the landing zone, segmented bodies twisting through broken stone as though rock possessed no more solidity than water. One burst beneath an auxiliary heavy weapons team and scattered men across the ground in pieces. A hex mark appeared atop a ruined defense bastion, with no warning at all, 6 pistols firing in a sequence too fast for mortal eyes to follow. Men died before the sound reached them. One round entered an officer beneath the jaw and burst through the crown of his skull in a spray of bone and brain. Another struck an intercessor's eye lens and drove him backward, helm shattered, face reduced to blood within the gorget. Titus saw the hex mark pivot toward Gadriel. He kicked the headless remains of a Necron warrior into the firing line. Rounds tore through the dead machine. Titus fired through the opening. The bolt struck the hex mark's lower torso, staggering it long enough for Gadriel to put a burst through its upper assembly. A Skorpek reached Titus before the hex mark fell. Its blade came down hard enough to crack the stone where he had stood a fraction of a second earlier. Titus stepped inside the next arc, locked the weapon against his left vambrace, and drove the chainsword straight into the destroyer's chest. Teeth screamed against necrodermis. Warning runes flashed across his visor as the motor overloaded under resistance. Titus pushed harder. The blade burst through the construct's back. The Skorpek convulsed, green light flooding from its torso, and then its broken limbs began moving again. Necrodermis flowed around the wound, trying to close. Titus planted one boot against its chest, seized the damaged upper body with both hands, and tore. Metal screamed. The torso separated from the lower assembly in a shower of sparks and molten fragments. He threw the upper half into the path of another destroyer and shot the machine through the head while it climbed over its ruined kin. Gadriel reached him a moment later. "The eastern line is requesting reinforcement." "Negative. They are auxilia." "I am aware." The request came through a mortal command channel moments later. The voice belonged to a battalion commander whose breathing was audible beneath artillery impacts. "Captain Titus, this is Colonel Arvin. Eastern perimeter is collapsing. We have destroyers inside the second trench line. Request immediate extraction or armor support." Titus glanced toward the tactical display. The eastern defense marker was blinking red. Beyond it, Necron reserve formations had turned away from the fortress approaches and were moving toward the auxiliary positions, exactly as required. "Hold your position." Static. Then, "Captain, my battalion has lost more than half its strength. We cannot hold indefinitely." "You will hold for 11 minutes." The colonel hesitated. 11? "Yes. And after that?" Titus watched 3 demolition team runes enter the fortress substructure. "After that, survive if you are able." The channel went quiet. Gadriel said nothing. He did not need to. Titus could see the casualty projections. Thousands of mortal soldiers would be dead before the chronometer completed its count. Their deaths would keep the destroyers facing east. Their deaths would allow the Astartes to enter the fortress. Their deaths were therefore useful. The breach opened beneath melter fire. Eradicators reduced a sealed gate to running slag, and heat rolled through the approach corridor like the breath of a furnace. Enfilading gas fire struck from galleries above. Titus entered first. Beams scraped across his armor, eating blue ceramite from the rim of one pauldron. He did not slow. His bolt pistol killed the first warrior. His chainsword took the second across the spine. A third struck him squarely in the breastplate, and the iron halo flared, a brief corona of light that turned the worst of the discharge aside. Gadriel followed with the standard now unfurled, blue and gold visible through smoke and green fire. Only when Titus had reached the far wall and broken the firing position did he order the rest of the squad forward. Gadriel understood then why men obeyed him, even when his orders sentenced them to death. Titus did not stand outside the arithmetic. He counted himself among the resources available for expenditure. The fortress interior was alive. Scarabs poured from seams in the walls in metallic tides, swarming over wounded auxilia who had followed the breach. One man disappeared beneath them while still screaming. When the swarm moved on, nothing remained above his boots except red smears and fragments of exposed bone. Wraiths passed through solid walls and emerged among the tech marines, attempting to reach the control nexus. One drove a bladed limb through an armor joint and tore a tech marine from his feet. Plasma fire answered, filling the chamber with white heat. A wraith took the blast through its center and vanished inside an expanding globe of incandescent metal. Melter weapons turned whole sections of corridor into molten wreckage. Scarabs crawled through the fluid metal regardless, and died only when flamers washed them into glowing ruin. The grand scale of the Void War had vanished. There was only the next doorway, the next murderous shape appearing through stone, the next warning rune on an Auspex display. The tech marines reached the nexus with 3 minutes remaining on the auxilia chronometer. The chamber was a cathedral of black geometry, built around a column of green light that extended beyond sight in both directions. Data moved across its surface in symbols no human mind had been designed to understand. Demolition charges were fixed to structural nodes, while machine priests forced captured interfaces to yield fragments of meaning. Transmission architecture detected, one tech marine reported. Multiple subordinate pathways, planetary targets. Titus approached. Mordain Prime appeared as a broken projection. 3 points glowed beneath its surface. Lines extended from Necron positions across the system toward those locations. Not random reinforcement routes, convergence. Gadriel saw it. They are gathering. Yes, Titus said. Every battle is concealment. For what? Titus looked at the 3 buried sites. For whatever Amantar came here to take. The charges detonated as the auxilia chronometer reached its end. The nexus ruptured. Green light became white. Shockwaves tore through the fortress, breaking columns, collapsing galleries, and sending entire sections of the shattered moon sliding into the void. Across the system, Necron vessel formations faltered for the first time. Imperial ships surged toward the corridor Silver had demanded. Then, every Vox channel on Titus's armor screamed at once. The sound resolved into a voice older than any human language had the right to comprehend, translated by systems that should not have been capable of translating it. It spoke with no haste and no rage, only contempt measured across geological ages. Persistent flesh, you endure beyond your assigned moment of extinction. Titus stopped amid the collapsing chamber. Gadriel turned toward him. The voice continued. You have mistaken survival for significance. Come, little relic of a dying species. Witness the kingdom prepared for you. The transmission ended. On the tactical display, Mordain Prime changed. 1 green point became 10. 10 became hundreds. Hundreds became thousands. Across the planet's night side, dormant tomb structures awakened beneath hives, mountains, oceans, and ash wastes. Emerald lines spread over continents like veins beneath dead skin. Entire regions flared with cold light. The planet was not merely occupied, it was opening. Titus watched the network expand until Mordain Prime resembled an eye turning toward the stars. Somewhere below, Amantar waited. Somewhere below, the dead were rising in numbers no Imperial commander had yet calculated. Titus keyed the company-wide Vox. All forces, prepare for planetary assault. Mordain Prime had begun to open before the Imperial fleet had cleared the shattered moon, and Titus answered, awakening with violence. The order left the righteous fury as a single burst of command traffic and became catastrophe across half a hemisphere. Teleportariums burned with caged lightning as Terminator squads vanished from sanctified chambers and reappeared upon Necron command nodes already rising through hive foundations. Inceptors launched from gunships into the upper atmosphere, their jump packs blazing as they descended behind Xenos defensive belts beneath storms of green fire. Drop pods plunged toward fortress precincts, with retros screaming, punching through manufactorum roofs, transit causeways, and black structures that had not seen the surface of a living world since before mankind possessed language. Thunderhawks followed lower and slower, bearing armored vehicles in magnetic clamps beneath their hulls, while Imperial Navy landers entered the atmosphere in numbers great enough to turn the heavens black. Some never reached the ground. Necron fire caught them high above the clouds and split them apart, spilling burning men, tanks and cargo containers across hundreds of kilometers. Others struck prepared landing zones and opened their ramps before the engines had fully cooled, disgorging columns of infantry beneath the shouted commands of officers and the thunder of tracked armor. Titus watched the assault through his helm display from within a repulsor command tank descending beneath a Thunderhawk. The surface below was no longer a planet in rebellion against an invader. Entire districts of Mordain Prime were physically collapsing into geometries of living metal. Hives that had stood for millennia leaned above glowing chasms. Manufactoria burned from foundations upward. Necron monoliths rose from buried chambers among the towers of mankind, like tombstones thrusting through rotting flesh. All assault elements, Titus said across the command net, do not permit consolidation. Strike the structures while they are emerging. Destroy resurrection assets before pursuing retreating formations. There will be no second opportunity. Gadriel's reply came through static and weapons discharge. By your command, Captain. The Thunderhawk released the repulsor. For a moment they fell. Then gravitic engines caught them, and the war swallowed everything. The first Imperial beachheads were not won by Astartes. They were manufactured by exhausted mortals, working inside an industrial machine that consumed men as readily as ammunition. Basilisk batteries arrived in sprawling artillery parks, where each gun required shell carriers, loaders, ranging crews, fuel bowsers, engine seers, Vox operators, and entire Munitorum columns to keep it firing. Hundreds of tons of ammunition moved forward in tracked conveyors, while servitors trudged beneath artillery bursts, carrying crates whose weight would have crushed ordinary laborers. Lehman Russ squadrons ground through streets widened by engineering tanks fitted with dozer blades, their tracks crushing rubble, wreckage and bodies into one indistinguishable paste. Bane blades came later, immense enough that entire intersections had to be cleared for their passage, each super-heavy tank surrounded by fuel carriers, recovery vehicles, and companies of infantry protecting its vulnerable flanks. A damaged track assembly could immobilize one of the great machines as effectively as an enemy gun, and men died beneath Gauss fire, replacing links thicker than their torsos. Munitorum officers stood beneath armored awnings, calculating expenditure and attrition with the calm of accountants. Regiments became percentages. Armor losses became projected replacement tonnage. Human beings vanished into columns of ink, and the central assault drove through Manufacturum Precinct Carthax, beneath a sky the color of old blood. Repulsors skimmed above streets, choked with burning hab blocks, while gladiator battle tanks fired through curtains of smoke, their heavy weapons turning Necron ranks into showers of black fragments. Redemptor dreadnoughts advanced between them with ponderous violence, crushing barricades beneath armored feet and firing until the air tasted of ionized metal. Titus's transport had crossed less than 3 kilometers when the first doomsday weapon found the column. Green brilliance struck the lead gladiator. The tank did not explode immediately. Its frontal armor became transparent, then white, then liquid. The entire machine folded inward around its own reactor before detonating in a fountain of molten ceramite and bone. A second discharge struck the street and excavated a crater deep enough to swallow 2 infantry carriers. Doomsday emplacement, Upper Manufacturum Ridge, Gadriel reported. Line of fire established. The repulsor's gunner attempted to traverse. Titus was already at the rear hatch. Remain with the column. Maintain forward movement. Gadriel's voice hardened. Captain, artillery can reduce the position. In 9 minutes. Titus opened the hatch. I require it dead now. He hit the street at a run. Necron warriors occupied the Manufacturum steps in ranks 3 deep. Bolt rifles opened from behind Titus, their mass-reactive shells not punching neat holes, but entering metal torsos before detonating. Chests burst outward. Limbs spun away, trailing sparks. Heavy bolter fire struck another formation and reduced it to fragments large enough to continue crawling. Eradicators advanced from cover, melter rifles whining before beams of unbearable heat struck an emerging destroyer. Necrodermis liquefied in an instant, glowing yellow-white before pouring from the construct's frame like molten wax. Hellblasters fired beside them. Plasma bolts crossed the avenue as miniature suns, burning holes through immortals and leaving the stone behind them glassed. One plasma incinerator screamed an overheat warning. Its wielder vented the weapon, but the coils had already gone critical. The gun burst against his armor, taking his forearm with it and filling the air with incandescent fragments. The battle brother did not scream. He dropped the ruined weapon, locked his remaining hand around a bolt pistol, and continued advancing. Titus reached the stairs. His chainsword snarled against the first warrior's spine, teeth grinding on living metal before finding purchase. The weapon did not cut cleanly. It chewed, kicked and ripped until the torso separated from the pelvis in a spray of sparks and black fluid. Titus shot another through the skull at such close range that fragments rang against his breastplate. The doomsday arc above them began traversing. Gadriel, I see it. A gladiator lancer fired from the avenue. Its laser destroyer struck the Ark's flank hard enough to cant the machine sideways. Titus used the heartbeat of disruption to charge beneath its weapon assembly and drive a crack grenade into a damaged seam. Clear! The detonation tore open the housing. Melter fire followed. The ancient weapon became a furnace. The advance should have accelerated after the emplacement fell. Instead, the dead began standing behind them. Necron warriors previously broken by bolt fire twitched among the ruins. Detached limbs scraped across the ground toward ruined torsos. Green sparks crawled through shattered skulls. Bodies that had been reduced to apparently useless fragments dissolved into lines of emerald light and vanished, drawn back toward resurrection machinery, buried beyond Imperial sight. An intercessor squad reported fire from a building already cleared. Another lost 2 warriors when Immortals reappeared behind their position. Titus halted the spearhead for less than a minute. "Do not pursue individual reanimations," he ordered. "Target the mechanisms sustaining them. Tech Marines mark resurrection signatures. Flamers scour concentrations of fallen constructs. Dreadnoughts destroy remains beyond recovery." The battlefield changed immediately. Flamestorm weapons washed piles of damaged Necrons in burning promethium until living metal sagged and bubbled. Redemptors strode through wreckage, grinding bodies underfoot until limbs, skulls, and torsos became metallic slurry. Eradicators ignored advancing warriors long enough to melt Canoptech repair constructs moving behind them. When green light gathered around fallen enemies, bolt squads poured fire into the reanimation nodes rather than the rising bodies. The Necrons continued returning, but more slowly. Titus watched the pattern adjust. "They are not immortal," Gadriel said. "No," Titus replied. "They are merely accustomed to enemies who surrender to the appearance of immortality." The orbital pylon revealed itself when Silver attempted to bring the fleet's lance batteries against the largest tomb breach east of Carthax. The sky turned green. A beam climbed from the horizon and struck an Imperial cruiser beyond visual range. The vessel's void shields failed in rippling layers, and then half the ship disappeared from the auger display. Silver's voice entered Titus's command net beneath alarms. "Planetary anti-orbital emplacement confirmed. Surface coordinates transmitted. Until it is disabled, I cannot bring capital weapons within effective range of your eastern theater." Titus enlarged the tactical rune. The pylon stood inside a fortress complex whose defensive density was greater than anything the Second Company could assault without unacceptable delay. Necron phalanxes covered every approach. Monoliths occupied the lower terraces. Destroyer concentrations moved through the outer galleries. Gadriel studied the map. "A direct attack will stall." "Yes. Then we require them to look elsewhere." Titus opened the mortal command frequency. "Armored Brigade Callistin, acknowledge." A tired voice answered. "Callistin command receiving. Your brigade will assault the western face of the pylon complex." There was a pause. "Captain, reconnaissance places several Necron phalanxes and at least 3 monolith-class constructs on that axis." "Correct." Another pause, longer this time. "What support do we receive?" "Artillery, until you enter minimum range." The commander understood before Titus said the rest. "We are the diversion. You are the force that will compel the enemy to turn." "Expected survival?" Titus looked at the projections. "Insufficient to matter." The officer breathed once across the vox. "Understood." Then, quieter, "For Macraga and the Emperor." The channel closed. Callistin attacked with nearly everything it possessed. Lehman Russ battle tanks emerged from smoke in lines broad enough to fill the horizon, battle cannons firing, while infantry carriers followed beneath the thunder of artillery. Baneblades advanced among them like moving fortresses. Their guns killed monolith escorts and blasted entire ranks of warriors apart. For several minutes, the assault looked unstoppable. Then the Necrons answered. Doomsday fire struck the first Super Heavy and burned through its armor from prow to engine compartment. Crewmen escaped from side hatches already on fire. Gauss beams swept the tank column and left vehicles standing empty, their crews disintegrated inside them. Destroyers tore into the flanks, hyperphase blades cutting through tank armor and men with equal indifference. A kilometer of ground became burning wreckage. Infantry climbed over shattered tracks because retreat was not authorized. Basilisks continued firing behind them until counter-battery fire found the guns and turned artillery crews into red mist across their own ammunition stacks. Titus watched hostile markers rotate toward the western face. Now! Thunderhawks came in below the pylon's principal firing arc, so low their engines threw debris from the ruins beneath them. Anti-aircraft fire clawed at their armor. One gunship lost an engine and struck the outer terrace, sliding through Necron formations in a burning mass before disappearing over the edge. Assault squads jumped before impact, descending on columns of fire. Titus's Thunderhawk slammed against the upper gallery long enough for the ramp to drop. He was moving before it touched stone. Immortals waited in disciplined ranks. At this range, their Gauss blasters could have annihilated mortal infantry, but there was no room for ordered volleys. Titus fired his heavy bolt pistol into the nearest faceplate and hit the line bodily. His shoulder drove one immortal over the parapet. It fell hundreds of meters into the battle below. Another struck his breastplate with a Gauss burst that peeled blue ceramite from the Aquila. Titus seized the weapon, forced the barrel aside, and drove the chainsword through the Necron's throat. Teeth screamed against reinforced living metal. He twisted until the head tore free. Gadriel reached the gallery behind him, the second company standard snapping loose in the hot wind. Upper terrace secure. Make it permanent, Titus ordered. Gadriel drove the standard's base into a fracture between black slabs while the assault force spread through the emplacement. The banner of the Ultramarines rose above the Necron pylon while demolition teams entered the power chambers beneath it. Tech Marines worked among mechanisms that pulsed with energies older than Terra's first cities, placing melter charges where analysis predicted catastrophic structural failure. Wraiths phased through walls to stop them. Blade Guard intercepted the constructs at sword length. Power weapons burst with blue-white energy. A Wraith drove its claws through one veteran's abdomen and lifted him from the ground. The Marine answered by burying his sword in its cranial assembly, while his own blood poured down his legs. The Tech Marines did not look up. Charges set, one reported. Titus keyed the fleet. Silver, pylon failure imminent. Acknowledged, orbital solutions prepared. Titus looked across the tactical display. Imperial forces still crowded the lower western approaches. Calistin had broken through farther than projected. Surviving tanks were fighting among the outer terraces. Withdraw all forces from target zone, he ordered. The first reply came almost immediately. Captain, withdrawal routes are blocked. We require additional time. Another officer cut across him. My battalion has wounded still moving from the western galleries. A third voice demanded transport capacity that did not exist. Titus studied the pylon's power readings. Necron systems were attempting to reroute. You have 90 seconds. Silence held the channel for a moment. Then someone said, Captain. Titus terminated the transmission. Gadriel stood beside the standard, looking toward the lower battlefield, where Imperial armor still burned among the Necrons. 90 seconds will not clear them. No. Then they die with the fortress. Yes. Titus triggered the demolition sequence. The pylon broke from within. Green light surged up its height before the upper structure split and began falling into the terraces below. Necron defensive fire vanished from the sky. Silver did not waste the opening. Imperial lance batteries fired from orbit. The clouds became white. Columns of energy descended with the violence of judgment and struck the fortress district from one horizon to the other. Stone, living metal, tanks, men, wounded, dead, and entire defensive galleries ceased to possess separate identities. The ground rose in an incandescent wall. Shockwaves flattened Manufactoria kilometers away. Survivors outside the target zone were thrown from their feet beneath a rain of molten debris. Titus watched friendly markers disappear from his helm display in clusters. Calistin ceased to exist as an operational brigade. He did not look away. Their sacrifice had destroyed the pylon. The pylon's destruction had opened the sky. The sky would permit the next attack. That was the sum of it. Victory lasted less than 3 minutes. New reports flooded the command network. Tomb openings had appeared across the continent. Monoliths were materializing behind Imperial lines already considered secure. Necron aircraft had seized the upper atmosphere above 2 hive regions. Entire defense sectors stopped transmitting without warning. One city of several million souls disappeared from the strategic display after its reactor grid collapsed into a subterranean complex that should not have existed beneath it. Titus watched the map turn green. The truth became unavoidable. Mordain Prime had never been invaded. Humanity had constructed hives, rail lines, shrines, factories and palaces upon the roof of a dead empire. Every foundation shaft, every mine, every buried transit line had been driven into the skin of a tomb world without understanding what slept beneath it. Silver's voice returned. "Captain, orbital augers have gained penetration through the crust following the pylon's destruction. You need to see this." A new image replaced the battlefield. 3 primary tomb complexes descended beneath Mordain Prime, each larger than the hives built above them. Their deepest structures did not remain separate. Vast subterranean arteries connected them, converging thousands of meters below the surface upon a central architecture so enormous that the augur cogitators initially classified it as geology. Titus enlarged the image. It was not geology. It was a structure larger than any imperial city in the hemisphere, buried beneath kilometers of rock and human civilization. At its center burned a single containment signature. Cornelius spoke over the command channel, his voice strained. "That energy is not Necron." Titus already knew. He had seen similar readings in the Reclamation archives. The signal belonged to something older than the Necrons, as they now existed, something they had once worshipped, enslaved, and broken into shards. The Nightbringer. Amentar had not come to conquer Mordain Prime. He had come to retrieve what slept beneath it. Titus stared at the burning point beneath the world and understood that every battle above them had been camouflage. "All commands," he said. "Reclassify strategic objective. Planetary defense is secondary." Gadriel turned toward him. "And the primary?" Titus magnified the buried structure until its cold light filled his visor. "We reach the shard before Amentar does." Hive Enoch screamed before the Ultramarines entered it. Warning sirens had been sounding for so long that their rising and falling wail had ceased to possess urgency and become instead another element of the city's atmosphere, as constant as the grinding of manufacturing machinery or the incense smoke gathering beneath cathedral vaults. The hive sprawled across Mordain Prime like a mountain fashioned by generations of exhausted hands, tier upon tier of hab blocks, factorums, transit arteries, shrine districts, and defense bastions rising kilometers into a poisoned sky. Tens of millions remained trapped inside it. The mag rail lines leading west had been severed when a Necron monolith materialized beneath the primary transit exchange and rose through 6 subterranean levels, destroying every tunnel above it. The northern evacuation causeway lay beneath the wreckage of an Imperial Navy lander. The southern routes had become killing grounds stalked by doom scythes, their weapons cutting refugee columns into burning fragments whenever men dared venture beyond the shelter of the hive walls. Within the lower districts, corpse wagons moved constantly. Servitors hauled bodies toward temporary crematoria until the furnace doors jammed with bone. Ecclesiarchy priests marched through the avenues carrying reliquaries and iron aquilers, shouting litanies above the artillery, while workers followed them clutching autoguns, mining drills, cutting torches, and lengths of sharpened metal. Somewhere beneath all of it, below the oldest foundations, the secondary tomb entrance waited. Titus came down through the smoke, aboard a Thunderhawk with Gadriel and the strike force harnessed behind him. Assault intercessors occupied the forward restraints, chains wards locked across their breastplates. Hellblasters sat opposite them, beneath the glow of plasma coils held in magnetic brackets. 3 tech marines remained motionless near the rear ramp, crimson armor marked with the cog-toothed skull of Mars and the inverted omega of Ultramar, mechadendrites folded against their backs like dormant limbs. The aircraft shuddered as something struck the armor beneath the starboard wing. Warning runes flashed, then vanished when the machine spirit accepted damage control. Approach corridor remains contested, the pilot reported. Hostile aircraft above the central spire. Titus watched the tactical display. Mortal defense formations were fighting upward through the hive to hold the evacuation routes, while his force would move in the opposite direction, descending toward the tomb network. The symmetry was almost obscene. Millions climbed toward a sky that might kill them. The Ultramarines descended toward a grave older than mankind. "Land us at Transit Sanctum Solus," Titus ordered. "Captain," the pilot said, "the pad is under intermittent fire." "Then remain there intermittently." The Thunderhawk struck the landing platform hard enough to make the restraints groan. The rear ramp lowered onto a district already half destroyed. Buildings leaned against one another across streets filled with rubble and dead. A basilica had lost its western transept. The statues of saints along its exterior were headless, their broken stone faces lying among ammunition crates and human remains. Mortar fire boomed somewhere deeper in the hive. Titus descended into air thick with ash and the smell of burned meat. An officer of the local defense forces reached him with blood dried along one side of his face. "Captain Titus, Emperor be praised. Lower transit is still accessible through the sanctum, but the underhive is compromised." "By Necrons?" "Not only warriors." The officer hesitated, and that hesitation told Titus more than the answer. "We found shelters, sealed shelters, doors intact from the inside." His voice lowered. Everyone inside had been skinned. Gadriel looked toward the transit entrance. "Flayed ones." The officer nodded once. "They are moving through the ventilation shafts, through walls, some men claim." "They do not move through walls," Titus said. "They move through places your men do not understand. Hold the upper routes." "For how long?" "Until the civilians are removed, or you are dead." The officer looked at him for a heartbeat, then struck a fist to his breastplate. "By his will." The first shelter lay 2 levels below the transit sanctum. Its blast doors had been opened with cutting charges by the defense troops, and nothing inside resembled refuge. The corridor beyond was carpeted with skin. Not bodies. Skin. Faces hung from ventilation grills, where flayed ones had hooked them like votive offerings. Long sheets taken from backs and torsos had been stretched across devotional alcoves, still wet enough to shine beneath failing lumens. The corpses lay farther in, naked and red, some flensed with such precision that muscles remained intact beneath the absence of flesh. There was no evidence of feeding, no gnawed bone, no bite marks. The machines had not eaten. They had imitated eating, imitated wearing flesh, imitated a biological need their immortal bodies could never satisfy. That made the scene worse. A tyrannid killed because hunger directed it. A flayed one killed because something broken inside its ancient mind demanded a grotesque parody of hunger forever. One survivor remained crouched beneath a collapsed bench. He was an old factorum worker, hands locked around his knees, eyes fixed on nothing. An assault intercessor knelt beside him. "Citizen, can you stand?" The man did not move. He whispered the same sentence repeatedly. "They wore us. They wore us. They wore us." Titus stepped past him. "Mark him for evacuation." Gadriel glanced toward the bodies. They entered a sealed compartment without breaching the doors. "Dimensional translation," one tech marine said. "Localized. Crude compared with primary Necron translocation systems, but sufficient." Titus looked toward the ventilation shafts. "Then every sealed refuge in this hive is a trap, until proven otherwise." They fought downward. The architecture changed by degrees. Imperial rockcrete gave way to older foundations. then to black stone no Imperial survey had recorded. Shrine niches ended abruptly, where geometric walls cut through them at impossible angles. Transit rails disappeared beneath perfectly smooth metal that reflected no light. Assault intercessors cleared intersections with bolt pistols and chainswords, while hellblasters held the longer approaches. Flayed ones came in spasms rather than formations. One moment a corridor would be empty. The next, a dimensional tear opened like a wound in the air, and shrieking metal bodies erupted through it, wearing strips of human flesh. Bolt rounds burst inside skeletal torsos. Plasma incinerators turned entire creatures white-hot before their necrodermis sagged into molten ruin. Chainswords became clogged with wet tissue stolen from corpses, their teeth throwing bloody strips across walls already marked with Imperial prayers. One flayed one reached a hellblaster before Titus could intercept it. Its claws punched beneath the Marine's gorget and opened the throat within his armor. Blood flooded down the warrior's breastplate. Titus seized the creature by the spine and hurled it against the wall hard enough to break 3 of its limbs, then stamped through its cranial housing. "Gene seed recovery," he ordered. An apothecary moved forward while the battle continued. The compromised Hab district revealed itself through the Auspex before they saw it. Thousands of movement signatures crawled through the ventilation systems beneath Habitation Block Mortis, moving toward Concourse 9, where more than 300,000 civilians waited for evacuation transport. Defense troops had barricaded the access routes, but the flayed ones were bypassing them through maintenance shafts and forgotten ducts. A tech marine projected the structure above his vambrace. "At current rate, first hostile contact reaches the concourse in approximately 6 minutes." Gadriel examined the map. "Seal the internal shutters." "Insufficient," the tech marine replied. "Multiple maintenance channels bypass blast isolation." Titus saw the Prometheum reserve lines. The Hab block's emergency generators drew from 3 buried tanks connected to the ventilation network by fuel service conduits. "Can the ventilation system be flooded?" The tech marine turned his helm toward him. "With Prometheum vapor." Gadriel understood at once. "There are civilians still inside the Hab district." "Approximately 180,000, the tech marine said. "Confirmed. Likely more." The figure hung between them while the hostile signatures moved closer to the concourse. Titus said, "Seal every blast door between Mortis and Concourse 9. Redirect Prometheum into the ventilation shafts." Gadriel's face hardened. "Captain, do it." The orders propagated through the hive. Blast doors descended across Transit Mortis. Men beat against them from the wrong side. Vox channels filled with confusion, then panic, as defense troops realized the district had been isolated. Prometheum pumps awakened beneath the floors. Vapor hissed through ventilation grills, heavy and oily, flooding tunnels where flayed ones climbed toward the concourse. Titus listened to the reports while watching the chronometer. "Ignition ready," the tech marine said. Gadriel stood beside him, silent until the final evacuation shutter locked. "They have not cleared the Hab block." Titus looked at him. "They will not. There are loyal servants of the Imperium in there. There are millions beyond them." Gadriel's jaw tightened. "I know the arithmetic." "Then understand the decision." For the first time, anger entered Gadriel's voice, though it never rose beyond the control expected of an ultramarine. "Understanding does not make it clean." Titus turned back toward the tactical display. "Command does not require that you enjoy a choice, Gadriel. It requires that you make it before the enemy makes it for you." He triggered ignition. Fire moved through Habitation Block Mortis like a living thing. The first explosions tore through maintenance shafts beneath the district. Then the ventilation system became a furnace. Prometheum vapor ignited from level to level, blasting fire through ducts, service corridors, lift shafts, and Hab passages. Flayed ones vanished inside orange-white flame. So did the men trapped with them. The pressure wave ruptured windows dozens of levels above, throwing bodies and burning debris into the streets. Screams flooded the Vox for seconds before heat destroyed the local relays. Concourse 9 remained sealed until the temperature readings beyond the blast doors began to fall. The hostile movement signatures disappeared one after another. Hundreds of thousands died within the district. More than 3 million civilians in the evacuation route beyond it continued moving. Titus did not ask whether the exchange had been worth the cost. The numbers had answered before the order was given. They descended beyond the burned district and entered a chamber that belonged entirely to the dead empire beneath the hive. Imperial architecture ended at its threshold. No Aquilas, no Gothic buttresses, no maintenance conduits. The walls curved upward in black surfaces, inscribed with shifting glyphs. Green light moved beneath the floor like blood through veins. The sound of weapons echoed from ahead. Titus raised a fist. The Ultramarines advanced into firing positions and discovered Necrons killing one another. A phalanx of warriors and immortals held a narrow causeway against destroyer constructs swarming from the opposite gallery. At their center floated a cryptek draped in segmented metallic robes, its elongated staff shedding cold emerald light. Skorpek destroyers hacked through their own kind with the same enthusiasm they had shown against humans. A Lockhurst weapon struck an immortal and reduced its torso to fragments before the broken machine could begin reanimation. The cryptek turned its skull toward Titus. A burst of alien code flooded the Ultramarine Vox, transformed by armor cogitators into harsh, low Gothic. Biological Commander, suspend hostility or perish beside us. Gadriel raised his bolt rifle. Xenos arrogance survives remarkably well under pressure. Titus watched the destroyers. Hold fire unless fired upon. The cryptek's eyes brightened. Unexpected cognition. Use it quickly. The cryptek identified itself only by a title that translated imperfectly as Keeper of the Ninth Seal. It spoke while its warriors continued firing into the destroyers. The one you name Amantar is not sovereign. It is contagion given locomotion. Destroyer madness spreads in its wake. Protocols degrade. Dynastic command becomes irrelevant. Every damaged mind turns toward one imperative. Extermination, Titus said. Crude, but sufficient. A Skorpek reached the causeway and lost both legs beneath Hellblaster fire. The cryptek continued. Amantar has seized control of multiple containment engines. It draws imprisoned star god fragments toward a central convergence. Gadriel looked toward Titus. The Nightbringer. Fragments, the cryptek corrected. Shards, splinters of a thing once greater than your species possesses language to describe. Its mechanical voice carried something very close to disgust. Even combined, they would remain less than the whole. That distinction will not comfort your armies when they die. Titus stepped closer. Why prevent it? Because madness that consumes lesser dynasties eventually approaches greater ones. Because a released star god is a weapon that remembers hatred. Because we broke the Citan once, and some of us possess enough sanity to remember why. The cryptek tilted its skull. Do not mistake explanation for fellowship, human. Your species squats upon our tombs and calls the theft civilization. Then we understand one another. For the moment. The moment ended when the wall behind the cryptek exploded. Skorpeks came through first, blades tearing black stone apart. Lockhurst destroyers swept above them and fired. One shot struck an ultramarine through the chest. Ceramite, ribcage, and both hearts became a burst of red ruin against the wall behind him. Another beam passed through a Necron warrior and left half its body collapsing into molten fragments. No order established the temporary cooperation. Survival did. Ultramarines fired past Necron shoulders, while Immortals discharged gas blasters between blue-armored giants. Gadriel's bolt rifle shattered a destroyer's cranial housing as the cryptek's staff reduced another to glowing particles. Titus met a Skorpek at the center of the causeway. Its hyperphase blade passed through his guard and scraped his breastplate, the iron halo bursting around him in a flash of white light. He drove his chainsword through the damaged joint beneath its torso and fired his heavy bolt pistol into the exposed machinery until the thing folded around the explosions. A Lockhust swung toward him. The Cryptek struck it first. Titus did not thank the Xenos. The fight lasted less than a minute. When the final destroyer stopped moving, the alliance ended with equal abruptness. The Cryptek turned toward a nearby Imperial Auspex relay carried by one of the tech marines. A subordinate Necron extended a probe toward the device. Titus shot it through the head. The bolt detonated inside the skull and threw burning fragments across the floor. Every surviving Necron weapon rose. Every Ultramarine weapon answered. "You were given information," Titus said, "not access." The Cryptek stared at the ruin of its subordinate. "Your aggression is primitive. Your next attempt will cost more." Silence held between them. Then the Cryptek lowered its staff. "There is a western transit artery beyond this chamber. It reveals nothing of your surface dispositions and returns to your tomb roots." Titus pointed toward it. "Use it. You believe you command me? I am permitting you to leave." The Cryptek's eyes burned brighter. "One day, your species will understand the difference between survival and permission." Titus replied, "Perhaps, not today." The Necrons withdrew into the black passage and vanished. Gadriel watched them go. "We should have destroyed them." "Yes, but not yet." "Correct." Titus turned toward the tech marines. "Transmit everything the Cryptek told us to the fleet." The response never came. Every lumen in the chamber dimmed simultaneously. Cornelius's voice broke across the vox, raw and strained. "Captain, something has happened beyond the planet." Static swallowed half the sentence. "The outer moon. Astropathic Station Canticus. Every sanctioned mind aboard it has died." Titus looked upward, as though kilometers of hive, rock and atmosphere did not stand between him and the void. "Cause?" Cornelius breathed heavily. "No psychic assault, no warp manifestation. They simply stopped." A pict feed forced itself across the command net. The image came from an Imperial monitor vessel on the far side of the system. At first, the moon remained visible beneath cold starlight. Then the light died. Not an eclipse, not cloud. Darkness spread across its surface until the entire satellite became a black disk against the stars. Something rose above it, vast, robed, thin beyond anatomy. A silhouette formed from absence rather than matter, and in one elongated hand it carried the outline of a scythe, large enough to cross mountain ranges. The pict feed shook as the monitor vessel's machine spirit screamed warnings no human operator understood. Gadriel stared at the apparition. The Cryptek spoke truth. Titus watched the spectral figure lift its scythe above the dead moon. "Not all of it," he said. "This is only the beginning." 18 hours was all Titus required, and Mordain Prime possessed no currency except blood. The captured Necron data had been transferred from the hive beneath armed guard and delivered into the hands of the Righteous Furies tech marines, who now labored without respite inside a sealed strategium annex, forcing scraps of meaning from glyphic structures devised by minds that had watched suns die. Demolition charges had to be brought down from orbit in quantities sufficient to break tomb architecture, measured in kilometers rather than chambers. Silver needed time to drag the surviving fleet into new firing positions around the planet, and time again to repair the lance batteries damaged during the destruction of the anti-orbital pylon. Thunderhawks required fuel, armor needed rearming, artillery shells had to be moved across ruined continents, and every minute the Imperium spent preparing was a minute Amantar could use to close his grip around the buried containment network. Titus stood beneath a hololithic projection of the Western Theater and watched hostile markers multiply until the map appeared diseased. Green icons spread through the lowlands, converging upon the bridgehead with mathematical certainty. The Necrons had understood the same equation. They knew the Imperium needed time, and they had come to murder time itself. Gadriel stood beside him beneath the torn standard of the Second Company. "Projected contact?" he asked. Silver's image answered from orbit, his face rendered in pale blue light. "Every major surface formation west of Hive Enoch is advancing. Estimated first impact in less than 1 hour. Full engagement shortly thereafter." Titus studied the lines. The front extended for hundreds of kilometers. Mortal armies held it because there were not enough space marines in the galaxy to stand upon every meter of ground that required dying for. "Issue the order," Titus said. "No withdrawal before the 18th hour." Silver did not immediately respond. "Regardless of losses?" Titus looked at the chronometer. "Regardless." Sergeant Marius Venn received the order in a trench full of dead men. He had served 19 years in the Macraga Defense Auxilia and had spent the last 6 hours sitting against the corpse of a Vox operator because there was nowhere else dry enough to rest. The dead man's blood had dried beneath Venn's boots, and artillery dust had turned both of them grey. Around him, the defensive lines stretched through fields that had once fed a hive district and were now divided by trench walls, tank revetments, ammunition pits, and rows of bodies awaiting collection that would never come. Lehman Russ battle tanks crouched hull down behind earthworks, their crews sleeping against tracks still warm from the previous engagement. Farther rearward, basilisk batteries fired ranging shots toward the horizon. Every discharge struck Venn in the chest like a physical blow. Baneblade super heavies waited beneath camouflage netting that fooled no Xeno sensor, but satisfied regulations drafted by men several sectors away. Air defense batteries tracked shapes hidden above the clouds. Munitorum trucks moved continuously behind the line, unloading ammunition crates beside soldiers too exhausted to thank them. A lieutenant climbed into Venn's section, carrying the regiment understood what regardless meant before the first Necron appeared. Ammunition was redistributed from dead platoons to living ones. Men with shattered arms were moved to crew-fed weapons, where only one hand was required. Troopers capable of standing were returned from casualty shelters after medici orderlies injected them with pain suppressants, strong enough to keep them conscious and weak enough that some would die from the wounds they no longer felt. Priests walked the firing step with chains of iron aquillas around their necks, pressing blood-slick fingers against foreheads and reciting last blessings as if delivering ammunition. Venn checked his Lazarifal charge pack, then the spare packs tucked into the mud beside him. The man on his left had been 17 when the war began and looked 50 beneath the grime. The man on his right was already dead, though nobody had removed him because his body blocked a crack in the trench wall. "You hear that?" the younger soldier asked. Venn listened. At first he heard only basilisks and the distant grumble of tank engines. Then came nothing. No chanting, no engines, no drums, no roar of aircraft. The absence moved across the battlefield before the enemy did. Venn raised his magnoculars and saw the first ranks crest the horizon. The Necrons came without spectacle. Rank after rank of warriors walked through falling artillery with the patience of machinery, returning to a task interrupted for geological ages. Basilisk shells burst among them and hurled black bodies into the air. Limbs spun away. Torsos vanished inside geysers of soil and fire. The formations did not slow. Broken warriors dragged themselves forward until green light gathered around them, and living metal began knitting across the damage. Scarabs flowed ahead in silver-black carpets, dismantling minefields by physically consuming casings, detonators and soil, until the path behind them was clean. Then monoliths appeared within the Imperial lines. They did not advance from the horizon. They simply became present behind fortifications, vast black structures surrounded by emerald radiance, and from their portals, fresh warriors marched into trenches whose defenders had been facing the wrong direction. Ven saw one rise less than a kilometer away and watched an entire heavy weapon platoon disappear beneath Gauss fire before the men could turn their guns. Destroyers came after, faster than the infantry phalanxes, their madness granting them an urgency the rest of the Necron host lacked. Lockhust constructs swept over shell holes hunting tanks. Skorpex ran directly into artillery bursts as if impact and dismemberment were merely inconveniences delaying the act of murder. The battlefield ceased being a line and became a layered machine for killing men in every direction at once. The Imperial answer was industry. Basilisk crews fired until the metal of their gun barrels glowed beneath the heat. Loading servitors hauled shells from ammunition stacks already burning at the edges. Heavy bolters hammered from bunker apertures and tore Necron warriors apart by sections, ripping arms from shoulders, breaking ribbed torsos and scattering skulls that continued to glow as resurrection protocols sought enough of the body to restore. Lehman Russ battle cannons fired over open sights when the enemy came too close for ranging. Shells struck the Necron ranks and threw metal bodies dozens of meters, some landing among Imperial trenches, where half-destroyed machines reached for soldiers with one remaining arm. Men beat them apart with entrenching tools, rifle stocks and grenades because there was no room to retreat. Gauss fire passed through the trenches in brilliant green lines. A trooper beside Ven vanished by layers. His flak armor disintegrated first, then the front of his chest became exposed muscle, then ribs, then nothing. His Lazarifal struck the mud before the last of his skull became drifting particles. Another beam crossed a heavy bolter nest and left 2 empty pairs of boots beside the weapon. Ven fired until his charge pack emptied, changed it with hands he could no longer feel, and continued firing because the order had said 18 hours, and the chronometer beside the command bunker showed they had survived less than 3. Requests for withdrawal began before the 4th hour. Titus received them inside a temporary command bastion, while Tech Marines worked on the decoded Necron data behind sealed adamantine doors. The first request came from the southern artillery sector. Our forward batteries are overrun. Request permission to displace remaining guns before they are encircled. Titus looked at the tactical projection. Denied. Continue fire until ammunition exhaustion or destruction. The second came from an armored regiment whose surviving companies had been cut in half by Lockhust destroyers. We can fall back 6 kilometers and establish another line. Negative. Your present position anchors the infantry front. The third voice belonged to a colonel who had begun the day commanding several battalions. His words arrived beneath the sound of men screaming over the Vox. Captain, I have less than a battalion left. Another hour here will annihilate us. Titus checked the chronometer. 8 hours remained. Annihilation is acceptable. Breakthrough is not. Silence. Then the colonel said, Understood. Titus closed the channel. Gadriel stood nearby, listening to the same requests. They are dying by regiment. Yes. The enemy knows we cannot replace them. The enemy also knows it must break them before we are ready. Titus looked toward the sealed doors where the Tech Marines labored. Therefore, the line remains. By the 10th hour, the Western Front was visible from orbit as a continent-spanning scar of flame. Artillery parks had become craters full of broken guns. Baneblades burned with their turrets torn open, ammunition cooking inside them in repeated detonations. Defense auxiliary units fought beside Astra Militarum formations, whose officers no longer knew where one regiment ended and another began. Men slept for minutes at a time beside corpses, because removing the dead had ceased to possess military value. Vox operators wrote unit names on their own armor, so that someone might identify what remained of them after the battle. Priests ran out of oil for blessings and used blood instead. Sergeant Ven's section had been reduced to 7 men. His lieutenant was dead. The youngest trooper had lost both legs beneath a Skorpek blade and continued firing a las pistol from the bottom of the trench until another Necron stepped on his skull. Ven killed that machine with a crack grenade forced into the joint beneath its pelvis. The explosion threw him into a corpse pile and burst his left eardrum. He climbed out because the chronometer still had not reached 18. At the 14th hour, Silver reported that fleet repositioning was complete. At the 15th, the demolition stores reached the surface. At the 16th, the Tech Marines confirmed they had broken the first layer of the Necron containment schema. Titus finally left the command bastion. The Thunderhawk carrying him crossed the western theater beneath a sky full of green fire. Doom scythes hunted through the clouds. Anti-aircraft batteries answered until the air itself seemed to tremble. One Gauss discharge scraped the gunship's flank and stripped armor from the port side, exposing internal frame members before the pilot forced the aircraft lower. "Landing zone is compromised," the pilot reported. Titus stood before the ramp with his chainsword in one hand. "Then land on the enemy." The Thunderhawk descended directly into the collapse of Ven's sector. Mortals looked up from trenches filled with blood and saw blue armor through the smoke. The gunship's heavy weapons opened before its landing struts touched earth, shredding a line of warriors crossing the broken parapet. The ramp came down. Titus stepped through Gauss fire with Gadriel and the surviving assault intercessors behind him. A Skorpek charged the trench. Titus met it at the lip. Its hyperphase blade carved through the air where his head had been a fraction earlier. He drove his shoulder into the construct's torso, forced it backward, and brought the chainsword across its spine. Teeth screamed against living metal. The machine turned with impossible speed, and another blade entered beneath Titus's right pauldron. Warning runes burst across his vision. The edge penetrated armor and bit into flesh. Titus trapped the limb by wrenching his upper arm against his breastplate, locking the blade inside his own wound. The Skorpek tried to pull free. Titus seized the limb with his gauntlet and twisted until the joint broke with a metallic crack. Then he drove the chainsword straight through the machine's chest and tore downward until the torso opened from sternum to pelvis in a shower of green sparks. More destroyers came. Gadriel struck one with a burst of bolt fire before closing with his blade. An intercessor was decapitated by a sweeping hyperphase strike that passed through his gorget as if the ceramite were cloth. His head struck the trench floor, still broadcasting a fragment of squad telemetry before the armor link died. Titus stepped over the body and killed the machine responsible. Another destroyer hit him hard enough to trigger the iron halo. Light exploded around Titus in a sphere of force. The next impact came before the device had recovered, and the halo failed. A warning rune turned black. The destroyer's blade scraped across his breastplate, carved through the lower edge of the aquila, and opened a red line across the flesh beneath. Titus ignored it. He fired his heavy bolt pistol into the enemy's abdomen until explosive shells blew the lower torso apart, then stamped down on the crawling remains. His armor systems diverted power from non-essential functions. The iron halo rune flickered once, twice, then returned in weak amber. Titus smiled without humor beneath his helm. Again. The sight broke something in the exhausted men around him, not fear, but the certainty that exhaustion had been the final limit. Ven watched the captain of the second company move through the same killing ground that had consumed thousands of mortals, and understood why old stories called the Adeptus Astartes angels of death. Titus was not untouched. Blood ran from beneath his pauldron. His armor was scored and blackened. His iron halo flared intermittently under impacts. He simply continued after wounds that would have ended any human life in seconds. He hacked a damaged warrior apart before it could reanimate, seized another by the throat, and used its body to shield himself from Gauss fire, then hurled the smoking remains into a scarab swarm and followed with a grenade. Gadriel planted the company standard in the trench wall. "Ultramarines!" he roared. "Forward!" The word passed into mortal throats. Men who had spent 16 hours learning how to die climbed back onto the firing step. The final 2 hours became a battle without shape. Tanks fired until they exhausted ammunition and then used their hulls as barricades. Servitors carried shells through open ground after every human loader in one battery had been killed. Heavy bolter crews fought knee-deep in spent casings and body parts. A Baneblade with one track destroyed continued firing from a crater until a monolith's Gorse flux arcs stripped its turret and crew compartment into glowing dust. Titus moved wherever the line weakened. He did not inspire men with promises of survival. He gave them targets. He gave them firing sectors. He gave them seconds in which one more act remained possible. At 17 hours and 43 minutes, a commander requested withdrawal for the last time. Titus looked toward the horizon, where Necron ranks still advanced through fields of their own broken dead. 17 minutes, he said. The officer replied, "We have nothing left." Titus chambered another bolt. "Then spend nothing well." At exactly 18 hours, the order changed. Not victory, not relief, reorganization. Silver's fleet opened with long-range orbital fire against marked Necron approach routes. Reserve armor moved into shattered sectors. Ammunition carriers reached trenches whose defenders had been firing single shots to preserve the last of their charge packs. Medevac craft descended through smoke. Some formations had retained less than one man in 10. Others existed only as names on Munitorum slates because nobody survived to answer the Vox. Titus stood among burning tanks and ordered surviving units consolidated into composite battle groups. Rearm first, recover wounded second. Dead are to be moved only where they obstruct. Movement or firing. A mortal officer stared at him through a face black with soot. "Captain, the men have held for 18 hours. "I know." The officer seemed to wait for something else. Titus gave him none. "The enemy remains. Therefore, so does your duty." The Techmarine transmission reached him while the western horizon still burned. A data projection unfolded across his visor, translated from the captured Necron architecture. 3 containment sites appeared beneath Mordain Prime, then a 4th, then more. Gadriel stood beside him as the pattern assembled into a network converging beneath the planet. "These are not pathways to one prison," the Techmarine reported. "They are separate containment coordinates, multiple energy signatures. All are being translated toward the same convergence architecture." Titus stared at the readings. The Nightbringer manifestation above the distant moon had not been the awakening of a single shard. It had been evidence of a process. Amantar was gathering fragments. Shards of a star god broken in an age before mankind, each containing only a fraction of the ancient entity, and each still powerful enough to erase armies, were being dragged toward one another beneath the world. Gadriel's voice was low. "If they combine," the Techmarine answered with machine-cold precision. "Prediction exceeds reliable parameters." Titus looked across the battlefield. Millions had already died above those tombs. Millions more would follow if the convergence continued. Mordain Prime had ceased to be merely a world under siege. It was becoming an altar, and every corpse upon its surface was another offering laid before the resurrection of death itself. The vessel had no name the Imperium could pronounce, and so the augur crews aboard the Righteous Fury designated it Sepulchral Arc Primus, and tried not to consider the possibility that the designation might offend whatever ancient intelligence ruled within it. The ship moved above Mordain Prime without visible acceleration, a black crescent more than 10 kilometers from blade tip to blade tip, its surface swallowing starlight, except where veins of emerald energy pulsed beneath necrodermis plating. Imperial lance strikes had struck it 3 times during the preceding engagement. Macro shells had cratered its outer hull. Torpedoes had detonated across its spine with enough force to gut lesser cruisers. Each wound had closed. Metal flowed into metal without rivet, weld, or repair crew, until scars that should have represented thousands of tons of lost armor became smooth black surfaces again. Silver projected the vessel above the strategium table and magnified a cluster of energy readings buried deep within its core. "Containment routing traffic passes through this ship," he said. "Every transmission recovered from the planetary tomb network intersects with it before descending toward Mordain Prime." Titus studied the pulsing lines. 3 distinct signatures moved through the vessel, then disappeared beneath the planet. "The shards. We believe so." Silver looked toward him. "We cannot destroy the ship reliably from range." Titus's answer came without hesitation. "Then we will enter it." Preparations consumed less than an hour because no one aboard the battle barge believed they possessed more. Boarding torpedoes were armed and blessed beneath the incense of the armorium. Thunderhawks received additional ceramite plating over vulnerable engine housings. Teleport homers were issued to Terminator squads whose tactical dreadnought plate had survived wars dating back centuries. Tech Marines loaded melter charges, Auspex bafflers, and the void between the fleets became a furnace when the boarding wave launched. Torpedoes erupted from the Righteous Fury's flanks, each carrying squads of armored warriors inside adamantine coffins. Thunderhawks accelerated behind them beneath the covering fire of Imperial escorts. The Necron vessel reacted before the first craft had crossed half the distance. Lines of emerald light appeared without visible weapon discharge. One boarding torpedo simply ceased to exist. There was no explosion, only a brief expanding cloud of incandescent matter, where armored hull, machine components, and space marines had occupied space a heartbeat earlier. Another torpedo spun after losing half its prow and struck the arc at an angle, burying itself in the outer plating but failing to breach. A Thunderhawk turned violently to avoid a beam and crossed the path of another discharge. Its starboard wing vanished. The aircraft rolled, engines screaming through Vox channels as the pilot fought the machine spirit for control. Titus watched it tumble into the darkness until the Necron vessel's hull eclipsed the wreck. "Impact in 12 seconds, the torpedo servitor announced. Restraints tightened. Titus braced. The warhead struck. The impact felt like being buried beneath a collapsing fortress. Melter cutters ignited automatically around the torpedo's nose. Necrodermis glowed, softened, and then flowed aside beneath temperatures designed to breach battleship armor. The boarding capsule drove forward until momentum died inside the vessel. Explosive bolts released the forward doors. Titus stepped into a corridor that had not been built for anything that breathed. No deck plating marked where feet should travel. No lumen housings illuminated the walls. No pipes carried atmosphere because there was no atmosphere to carry. No crew quarters, access ladders, mess decks, chapels, ammunition stores or voidsman stations gave human logic to the architecture. Green light existed without a source, staining every surface without casting dependable shadows. The passage extended ahead for what Titus's optics measured as 80 meters, then revised itself to 140, then 63. Behind him, the same Auspex reported that the boarding torpedo was both 11 meters away and more than 300. "Sensor conflict," a tech marine reported. "Spatial geometry is unstable." Mataris looked into the corridor. "It is a ship." "No," Titus said. "It is a tomb that learned to move." Teleport lightning cracked deeper inside the vessel. Terminators materialized around homing coordinates laid by the first Tech Marine team, storm bolters already firing as Necron warriors emerged from the walls. The weapon reports thundered through the airless passage by conduction through armor and deck structure rather than atmosphere. Bolt shells tore into skeletal torsos and burst within them, hurling fragments across black surfaces that began healing the instant debris struck. Titus advanced with the boarding force, while servitors dragged teleport homers behind them on magnetic limbs. One servitor planted a beacon into the deck, only for the metal beneath it to liquefy and swallow half the mechanism before a tech marine cut it free with a plasma torch. "The vessel is rejecting foreign matter," he said. "Then be more offensive," Mataris replied. Titus glanced toward his former mentor. You have developed humor. Age is corruption of many kinds. The first Canoptech attack came from beneath them. The floor became a moving carpet of scarabs, without any opening or warning. Thousands of metallic bodies poured upward through the black surface and swarmed the front rank. Flamers ignited. Promethium burned green beneath reflected light and turned scarabs into molten droplets, but hundreds reached the Terminators before the fire could stop them. One veteran vanished beneath a glittering mass from the waist down. The swarm entered armor joints, dismantling seals and fiber bundles, tooth by microscopic tooth. He fired downward with his storm bolter until the muzzle flash disappeared beneath the creatures. A tech marine struck him with a burst from a plasma cutter, vaporizing scarabs and burning through sections of the veteran's greave with them. The Terminator remained standing. Then the wall beside him rippled, and a Canoptech wraith passed through it, as though armor plating were smoke. Its claws struck the warrior's left arm above the elbow. Tactical dreadnought armor endured for a fraction of a second. Then the limb came away in a burst of sparks, hydraulic fluid and blood. The veteran staggered, but did not fall. His armor sealed the stump with emergency compression, while warning runes screamed across the squad link. He shifted his storm bolter to his remaining hand. "Combat effective," he said. Titus answered, "Remain so." Automated weapons awakened in the ceiling. There had been no apertures before the firing began. Emerald beams cut through the boarding party and left blackened grooves across Terminator plate. One beam struck an accompanying servitor and stripped it from metal skull to spine in glowing layers, exposing augmetic organs before both flesh and machinery disintegrated. Melter rifles answered, turning sections of ceiling into flowing slag. The vessel repaired around the damage almost immediately. Black material climbed upward against gravity and rebuilt the surface, while tech marines watched through Auspex lenses, unable to agree whether the phenomenon represented regeneration, matter translation, or something for which the Mechanicus possessed no permitted word. The boarding force pushed deeper. Gravity rotated without warning. One moment Titus walked upon the floor, the next his armor crashed sideways against what had been a wall. Terminators reoriented through magnetic locks, while debris floated upward and disappeared into darkness. A corridor curved ahead, then folded across itself in a manner Titus's eyes accepted and his inner ear rejected. Mataris moved beside him. "You always did choose pleasant theaters. You recruited me. A youthful mistake. You were already old. Then an old mistake." They found the prisoners beyond a sealed field of transparent energy. Several hundred Imperial crewmen occupied a chamber shaped like a vertical shaft, though gravity held them against one wall, as if it were a floor. Their uniforms belonged to the St. Auric, an escort cruiser lost during the opening Void battle. Some had been wounded, others had been stripped of equipment. All were alive.
Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Support really helps.
They surged toward the barrier when the Ultramarines appeared. Hands struck the invisible field. Mouths moved. The chamber possessed atmosphere, but no sound crossed the boundary. A tech marine examined the control structure. "The compartment lies across our direct route to the navigation nexus." Titus studied the tactical feed. Destroyer signatures were approaching from behind the prisoners. Scorpex. More than the boarding force could easily contain within the narrow geometry. "Can you open the chamber?" "Yes." "Can you maintain atmosphere?" A pause. "Negative. Opening the forward seal collapses containment across the compartment." Mataris looked toward the prisoners. They were pointing now, having seen movement behind them. Green light grew at the far end of their chamber. The first destroyer emerged. "Alternate route?" Titus asked. "Unknown. Estimated delay significant." The destroyers accelerated. Titus watched the humans begin to understand. The prisoners hammered against the barrier. One officer drew an aquila from beneath his uniform and pressed it against the transparent field. Titus saw his lips form words he could not hear. The Emperor protects. Behind him, Scorpex came through the green light. "Vent the chamber," Titus said. Mataras turned his helm toward him. The tech marine obeyed. The atmosphere disappeared explosively. Hundreds of men were lifted from the deck and hurled toward the opening seals. Bodies struck walls, one another, and exposed machinery. Blood erupted from mouths and eyes as lungs ruptured. Men clawed at their throats, though there was nothing to breathe. The officer holding the Aquila remained conscious long enough to look directly at Titus before his body spun away into the decompression stream. The destroyers were caught behind them. Human bodies and Necron constructs collided as the escaping atmosphere dragged everything toward the outer breach. One Scorpex struck the opening and jammed there. Another crashed into it. Titus raised his pistol. Now! Bolt fire destroyed both while they were trapped. When the chamber emptied, the boarding force crossed through the frozen bodies and metallic wreckage. None of the prisoners ever knew whether the Angels of Death had attempted to save them. Titus did not explain to the dead. The navigation nexus lay beyond a chamber where stars moved inside black crystal as though the vessel contained its own night sky. A tech marine approached the central structure, with mechadendrites extended and connected sacrificial. The vessel changed around them before transmission completed. Corridors began closing. Walls flowed together behind the boarding force. Teleport homers drifted across coordinate space, despite remaining physically stationary. The one-armed Terminator, who had lost his limb earlier, disappeared from the tactical display for 3 seconds, then returned standing exactly where he had been. "The ship is isolating us," a tech marine warned. "It is repairing faster than our breach teams can reopen the route." Titus looked toward the power. Conduits pulsing beneath the Nexus chamber. "Place charges." Mataras turned. "Inside the primary power architecture?" "Yes. Detonation may disrupt the vessel sufficiently to invalidate our extraction coordinates." "It will. You are proposing to cripple the chamber containing the only stable teleport references while we remain aboard." Titus maglocked his pistol and helped lift a melter charge into position. "Correct." Mataras watched him for a moment. "Reckless." Titus locked the charge against the conduit. "Recklessness requires ignorance of risk. I understand the risk perfectly." Mataras's reply came after several seconds. "That was not the reassurance you believe it was." They armed the charges and began withdrawal. The ship fought them. Wraiths emerged through sealed bulkheads. Scarabs consumed one teleport homer before the Terminators could save it. A corridor rotated 90 degrees and sealed half the force behind a wall that had not existed moments earlier. Melter charges opened it again at the cost of precious minutes. The Righteous Fury transmitted extraction coordinates, then withdrew them as Necron interference corrupted the solution. Titus reached the breach chamber with fewer warriors than had entered. Outside, Thunderhawks attempted to approach, but the Sepulchral Ark's defensive arrays turned the void around them into a lattice of green death. One pilot reported that no path existed. Silver's voice entered the command net. "Captain, hold position. I am creating one." The Imperial cruiser Lord Helican broke formation moments later. Titus watched its icon accelerate directly across the Necron vessel's firing arc. It was an old ship, scarred along its prow, carrying thousands of crew and enough accumulated devotional markings to cover entire cities. Silver had ordered it to become visible. The arc complied. Green beams struck the cruiser's forward shields. They collapsed. Armor vanished. Decks opened to vacuum one after another. The Lord Helican continued turning, presenting its broadside and firing every surviving macro battery into the Necron vessel. The barrage did little lasting damage, but it demanded attention. A second beam cut through the cruiser amidships. Internal explosions blossomed down its length. Escape craft launched from the far side, only to disappear beneath defensive fire. Thousands of men died within seconds, so the Ark would look away from several dozen Space Marines. "Approach corridor open," Silver said. Thunderhawks came through the dying cruiser's debris field at full thrust. Titus ordered the charges detonated. The sepulchral arc convulsed beneath him. Green illumination failed across the chamber. Walls split. Gravity vanished entirely. The boarding force leapt for the Thunderhawk ramps, while fragments of black architecture floated around them. Mataras entered last beside Titus. Behind them, the corridor folded inward and sealed itself in darkness. The gunship accelerated away as the Necron vessel began repairing the wound. Through the side viewport, Titus saw the Lord Helican finally break apart. Its stern reactor detonated, turning half the wreck into a white sphere before darkness swallowed it. Silver's voice remained steady over the Vox. "Extraction confirmed." Titus looked at the burning remains. "The cruiser?" There was a pause. "Lost." Nothing else needed saying. The recovered data filled the strategium when Titus returned to the Righteous Fury. 3 Cetan shard signatures revolved around the projection of Mordain Prime. Their trajectories converged upon the buried chamber identified aboard the Ark. At the chamber's center floated a geometric prison of nested dimensions, a tesseract structure whose energy boundaries shifted faster than Imperial cogitators could model. Several sections pulsed red under Mechanicus translation. Others simply disappeared from the display and returned seconds later. Cornelius stood at the edge of the hololith, with fresh bandages covering his ruined eyes. He did not need sight to understand what the Tech Marines had found. The astropath gripped his staff until the knuckles beneath his skin whitened. "The containment is failing," one Tech Marine said. "Not catastrophically, not yet." Titus watched one of the dark signatures move closer to the central prison. "How long?" "Unknown." Cornelius lifted his head. Every servo skull around him began trembling. "You do not need a chronometer for this, Captain." His voice had lost its usual bitterness. What remained was fear. "The thing inside is waking up." The strategium of the Righteous Fury had become a chapel to annihilation. Hololithic projections hung above the command table in layers of pale light, showing Mordain Prime, its exposed tomb complexes, the surviving Imperial bridgeheads, the disposition of the fleet, and beneath all of them, the 3 dark signatures moving through the planet toward the failing Tesseract architecture. Tech Marines stood among naval officers and tactical serfs, while the plan that followed was simple, only in the way execution orders were simple. The surface armies would attack across the western and equatorial theaters, compelling Amantar's destroyer hosts to remain committed above ground. Silver would take every void-worthy vessel remaining in the Reach and form an interdiction cordon around Mordain Prime, denying the Necron command ships freedom to reinforce the planet or extract additional containment assets. While both wars consumed the enemy's attention, Titus would lead an Astartes strike force through the buried arteries identified aboard the sepulchral arc and reach the convergence architecture from below. They would destroy the machinery drawing the shards together, then either force the fragments back into surviving tesseract structures or isolate them until heavier containment resources could be brought to bear. There was no reserve worthy of the name. The Western Line had already been rebuilt from the remains of shattered regiments. Imperial armor losses had exceeded the replacement stock available within the system. Silver had ships whose crews had sealed destroyed decks and returned to battle while the dead still floated beyond emergency bulkheads. Yet the hololithic projections offered no better answer. "Projected mortal losses to establish the surface breach?" Mataras asked. A Munitorum tactician displayed the calculation without meeting the Space Marine's eyes. "Between 600,000 and 900,000 combat personnel before the strike corridor becomes viable. Greater if destroyer concentrations shift south." Silence followed, not because the number shocked anyone, but because saying it aloud gave arithmetic the shape of men. Mataris turned from the projection and looked directly at Titus. You have begun accepting estimates like that before the sentence finishes. Titus met the veteran's gaze. Would you prefer surprise? No. Mataris rested one hand on the pommel of his weapon. I would prefer to know whether you still understand the difference between accepting necessary deaths and constructing plans that require them. Several mortal officers suddenly became interested in other tactical displays. Gadriel remained where he was. Titus answered without anger. Those soldiers are already in this battle. If I withdraw them, Amantar advances. If I scatter them, the destroyers consume them by formation. If I order them to attack, their deaths purchase access to the tomb. Mataris said nothing. Titus continued. I do not choose whether they are endangered. That choice was made when the enemy awakened beneath this world. I choose whether their expenditure achieves something. Mataris's face hardened. Men are not ammunition. No, ammunition is easier to replace. There was no cruelty in Titus's voice, which made the words colder. This war has moved beyond the scale at which every life can be preserved. I will not insult the dead by pretending otherwise. Mataris studied him for several seconds. Then remember what you are counting. Titus looked toward the casualty projection. I remember all of it. Gadriel stepped closer to the table. Then state the purpose, Captain. Titus turned toward him. Gadriel's expression held neither accusation nor doubt, only the demand of an officer who had learned that trust did not require silence. We are not committing these armies because Amantar insulted us. We are not doing it because the Second Company requires vengeance. We are not spending the reach to satisfy honor. Titus understood. No. Gadriel indicated the 3 shard signatures. We do it because if those fragments merge, the deaths already suffered here may become insignificant beside what follows. Correct. And if that assessment changes, then the plan changes. Gadriel gave one slow nod. The matter was settled. This was not a crusade of pride. The Imperium possessed enough graves made in the name of pride. This was colder. A stronger Nightbringer manifestation loose within Ultramar could break armies, erase planetary populations, and awaken terrors within neighboring tomb complexes whose existence the Imperium did not yet know. Mordain Prime could be sacrificed if necessary. The Reach could be sacrificed. Titus himself could be sacrificed. What mattered was preventing the thing beneath them from becoming powerful enough that such sacrifices ceased to matter. The enemy answered before the council concluded. Every active Vox channel aboard the Righteous Fury filled with a tone so low that deck plating trembled beneath it. Servitors froze. Bridge officers clutched at headsets. Across the surface, the same signal penetrated tank intercoms, trench Vox sets, aircraft channels, and command frequencies without respecting encryption or spectrum. Then Amantar spoke. Biological infestation persists. The voice was articulate, dry, and immense, as though spoken by something that had spent ages forgetting why language was necessary. Your vessels excrete heat. Your soldiers leak inefficient chemistry into the soil. Your machines consume fuel so that they may crawl toward extinction at greater speed. Green symbols spread across the strategium displays without permission. I remember empires that harvested radiation from dying galaxies. I remember species whose cities moved between dimensions, while your ancestors were protein beneath an uncaring sea. They screamed when extinction found them. You will scream with less distinction. For several seconds the voice fractured into bursts of alien code before returning. The fragments remember. The bearer of the scythe remembers. Death does not hate you. Hatred implies preference. Death merely corrects the error of continuation. Cornelius tilted his head toward the speakers. It is becoming less coherent. Titus listened to the static beneath Amantar's words. No, more honest. Across Mordain Prime, the day ended without sunset. Necron structures exposed beneath the planetary crust began emitting pillars of green radiance into the upper atmosphere. Orbital sensors registered enormous energy shifts between tomb complexes and structures embedded in both moons. The system's star remained where it had always been, but its light dimmed over Mordain, as if some vast mechanism were interposing dimensions rather than matter between the world and its sun. The sky changed from ash-grey to black over the course of minutes. Not night. Night possessed stars. This darkness contained none. Emergency lumens awakened across the front and painted trenches in arterial red. Tank crews switched to thermal optics. Priests climbed onto parapets beneath the unnatural eclipse and shouted that the Emperor was testing his servants beneath the shadow of death. Some soldiers knelt. Others fired at the horizon simply because firing was easier than looking upward. Green light pulsed from tomb fissures in time with no rhythm human instruments could identify. Beneath that illumination, corpse fields seemed to move as scarabs crawled among the dead. Titus descended to the surface before the first offensive wave began. He stepped from a Thunderhawk into a command district where every mortal soldier stared at the black sky. "Look forward," he told them. "Nothing above you requires your attention until it begins shooting." The first impossible thing happened 70 kilometers east of the command district. It began as a distortion above a shattered tomb aperture where Necrons and Astra Militarum armor had been fighting for most of the day. Shadows lengthened without regard for the emergency lumens casting them. A Leman Russ commander reported that his own silhouette had turned its head while he remained still. Then men began aging. A platoon crossing open ground slowed as skin sagged from faces and hair whitened beneath helmets. One soldier took 3 more steps before his spine bent beneath decades that arrived in seconds. Another collapsed as muscle wasted from his limbs and teeth spilled from his mouth. Their armor remained unchanged around bodies becoming ancient inside it. Necron warriors nearby fared differently. Living metal softened. Ribbed torsos ran like wax. Skulls distorted into featureless masks, while green light poured through dissolving eye sockets. The battlefield stopped firing for one impossible heartbeat. Something rose from the tomb breach. It was not the complete figure seen above the distant moon, only a partial manifestation. A robed absence shaped approximately like a towering humanoid, because lesser minds required some geometry through which to perceive it. In one hand existed the suggestion of a scythe. Where its face should have been, darkness curved inward forever. The shard moved once. That was enough. A line of black force crossed the battlefield. 3 Leman Russ tanks became cold wreckage without explosions. Their crews were simply dead inside, bodies reduced to dry husks around bones that crumbled when the vehicles rolled to a stop. A Baneblade fired its volcano cannon at the apparition. The beam struck the robe of darkness and bent away, carving through an Imperial artillery position instead. Men, guns, and ammunition vanished inside the resulting detonation. Necron destroyers continued attacking, their obsession surviving even this. The shard turned its head toward them. 6 constructs collapsed into pools of liquid metal. It made no distinction. Imperial or Necron, organic or machine, loyal soldier or ancient killer. Everything nearby existed only as matter awaiting correction. Titus reached the edge of the manifestation aboard a repulsor that survived 6 seconds after entering the district. The vehicle's gravitic field screamed. Its hull aged visibly, blue paint flaking away as metal beneath it pitted and darkened. "Dismount," Titus ordered. The side hatch opened. He hit the ground with Gadriel and 5 intercessors just as the repulsor collapsed inward, its structural members losing cohesion. The shard stood beyond a row of shattered manufactorum towers. Titus did not charge it. No sane tactician mistook proximity for opportunity. "Withdraw west by cover," he ordered. A sweep of darkness crossed the district. The first intercessor never moved. His armor became grey, then black, then fell apart around a body that had aged centuries in a second. Another Marine raised his bolter, and the weapon rusted into uselessness between his hands before both arms withered inside their gauntlets. Titus's iron halo erupted as secondary energy struck him. White light enveloped his armor. Every warning rune flashed at once. The force field held for a heartbeat, failed, then restarted as emergency systems rerouted power from damaged subcircuits. The main discharge hit the broken manufactorum between Titus and the shard. Hundreds of tons of ferrocrete became powder. The collapsing structure buried 3 Astartes beneath it and threw Titus through a wall. He regained awareness beneath several tons of shattered masonry. His left leg was pinned. Half his visor displayed static. The iron halo rune remained black. Gadriel dragged a slab aside while dust rolled through the ruins. "Captain." Titus forced his leg free and rose. Beyond the wreckage, the partial manifestation was already receding, drawn back toward the tomb aperture by containment systems fighting to reclaim it. Where it had existed, thousands of soldiers and Necrons were dead, not butchered in the ordinary sense, simply ended by mechanisms that made bolter fire and chainswords seem almost merciful. Gadriel looked across the ruin. "We cannot fight that." Titus retrieved his chainsword from the rubble. "Not directly. If 3 fragments converge, I know." For the first time since the campaign began, Titus abandoned a strategy because it was too cautious. Silver received the new order from orbit. "Every available surface formation?" the Commodore asked. "Every one." "Captain, the southern defense line remains thin. If we commit the reserve armor to your penetration corridor, there will be nothing between the tomb systems and the evacuation zones. Then evacuate faster. And the fleet? Close the cordon. Bring every functional capital weapon within supporting range." Silver's image flickered beneath static. "If this attack fails, the Mordain Reach will be strategically defenseless." Titus looked toward the blackened battlefield where the shard had manifested. "If this attack fails, there will be nothing left worth defending." Silver held his gaze for a moment, then bowed his head once. "Understood. The fleet will commit." The order spread across Mordain Prime. Tanks that had been held in reserve started engines. Artillery crews received firing plans that would consume nearly all remaining heavy ammunition. Infantry formations were told to prepare for assault through sectors they had spent days defending. Thunderhawks descended to collect Astartes strike elements. Apothecaries distributed combat stimulants to wounded space marines who could still carry weapons. Munitorum officers struck surviving reserve figures from their slates because reserves no longer existed. Priests moved among mortal troops, offering absolution in bulk. In the black sky above them, Imperial ships changed course toward a battle from which many would not return. Far beneath the planet, no human eye witnessed the final confirmation. Containment pylons surrounded the convergence chamber in rings of black metal. One opened, then another, then another. Energy bled from their interiors like darkness given weight. Necrosaur Amantar entered the chamber at the head of a procession of destroyers, its bladed limbs wet with the residue of biological slaughter, the Unmaker gauntlet pulsing with sick green light. Around it, corrupted Necrons twitched with murderous impatience, while ancient machinery strained against commands it had never been designed to obey. Amantar raised its arms toward the failing Tesseract structure. 3 separate shadows moved within the chamber. They rotated slowly at first, each retaining its own impossible outline. Then the distance between them began to narrow. One shadow reached toward another. The second answered. The third unfolded like a vast black wing. In the silence beneath Mordain Prime, 3 fragments of death began drawing themselves toward a single shape. The offensive began everywhere at once. Across Mordain Prime, across the burning moons, across the orbital approaches and the broken manufactorum continents, war expanded beyond any scale a single human mind could contain. Billions were under arms, in shelters, on ammunition lines, inside engineerium decks, beneath collapsing hab spires, aboard troop conveyors, behind artillery pieces, at plasma reactors, inside medici stations, or running from districts already condemned by command. Whole cities emptied into trenches, while other cities were sealed and abandoned because evacuation routes no longer existed. Defense auxilia formations from the surviving hive clusters marched beside Astra Militarum regiments whose banners bore the names of worlds hundreds of light years distant. Munitorum servitors moved mountains of ammunition through rail yards already under fire. Men repaired tank tracks, while Gauss beams cut through the crews beside them. Priests blessed entire battalions in passing, because there was no longer time to bless soldiers individually. Above them, Imperial warships exchanged fire with crescent Necron vessels over a planet that looked diseased from orbit, its crust split by emerald fissures and incandescent bombardment scars. Within this planetary apocalypse, the Ultramarines were almost insignificant in number. Their blue-armored formations represented a fraction so small that the Strategium Cogitators displayed them only when magnification reached tactical scale. Yet Titus had no need to occupy every battlefield. He required the Second Company to reach one place, at one moment, and destroy the organ around which the entire dead empire had begun to move. The first Imperial armor wave advanced beneath an artillery barrage that made the horizon disappear. Mine-clearing vehicles led the columns, dozer blades, and explosive line charges, ripping through ground, seeded with canoptech traps and dimensional mines. Behind them came Lehman Russ companies in formation, battle cannons firing while still moving, their tracks crushing corpse fields into mud. Tank commanders stood half-exposed in cupolas because smoke and electromagnetic distortion had made vision blocks unreliable, some shouting ranging corrections into throat mics while green beams crossed the formations around them. Bane blades advanced between the lesser tanks like mobile fortresses, their main guns firing into monolith concentrations until the recoil shook entire streets. A shadow sword named His Wrath Endures halted behind the ruin of a cathedral and elevated its volcano cannon toward a Necron construct towering above a tomb aperture. The discharge turned night into day. A beam intended to wound Titans struck the black
machine through its center and tore it apart in an eruption of molten living metal. The Shadow Sword crew had less than 10 seconds to celebrate. A doomsday weapon answered from beyond the smoke, and the super-heavy tank vanished behind a sphere of green-white light. When the brilliance faded, nothing remained except a crater lined with glass and the forward half of one track assembly. Artillery regiments continued firing over it. Basilisks and manticores saturated resurrection sites identified by orbital augers, shelling the same coordinates again and again, so that Necron warriors attempting to reconstruct emerged into explosions that scattered them across kilometers of burning ground. The infantry went forward only after the bombardment had expended enough ammunition to supply lesser wars for years. The dead came up through it anyway. Tomb complexes split open across the advance zone and disgorged warriors in ranks that vanished into smoke. Some marched with sections of their bodies still repairing, rib cages open to green-lit internal machinery, missing arms rebuilding themselves, while Gauss flares rose in the remaining hand. Immortals followed in tighter phalanxes, their heavier weapons punching through infantry formations and light armor with contemptuous ease. Locust destroyers skimmed over the corpse fields, their repulsor bodies leaving no tracks as they hunted tanks whose crews rarely saw the shot that killed them. Scorpex ran directly into the armor columns. One leapt onto the glacis of a Lehman Russ and drove both hyperphase blades through the hull. The weapons passed through armor, driver, and ammunition storage in one motion. The tank detonated beneath the destroyer, throwing its broken body into another vehicle, where it immediately began trying to rise. Canoptech scarabs flowed behind the attack in rivers of black metal, dismantling wreckage, wounded men, and fortifications with equal indifference. A guardsman, missing both legs, dragged himself away from one swarm until the machines covered him from boots to face. His scream ended when they ate through his jaw. Monoliths materialized inside defensive zones that had taken Imperial engineers weeks to construct, their immense bulk crushing bunkers beneath them, while Eternity gates opened and fresh Necron ranks marched directly into the rear of human positions. There were no horns, no victory cries, no shouted oaths from the enemy. The Imperium screamed enough for both sides. The sky became another battlefield layered over the first. Thunderhawks descended through anti-air fire, with assault forces clamped beneath their hulls, while storm talons hunted night scythes between burning spires. Doom scythes cut through formations with sweeps of emerald energy that sliced aircraft apart from wing to wing. One Thunderhawk lost its cockpit and continued flying for several seconds under machine spirit control before striking an Imperial infantry column and cartwheeling through 300 meters of troops and vehicles. Men who survived the crash were crushed beneath falling wreckage from a night scythe destroyed moments later. Air defense platforms fired until their ammunition elevators warped from heat. Crews began carrying shells by hand up ladders, while fragments of aircraft fell around them. Pilots died without ever seeing the weapon that killed them, Auspex screens showing clear sky a fraction of a second before green light entered their cockpits. On the ground, nobody looked upward unless something was already falling toward them. There was too much death at eye level. Titus drove the second company into the center of it. Intercessors advanced in disciplined wedges through ruins where mortal formations had dissolved into separate knots of resistance. Bolt rifles fired in measured bursts, mass reactive shells entering Necron torsos before detonating and throwing ribbed metal across streets already buried beneath bodies. Eradicators moved behind them, melter rifles concentrated upon monolith escorts and heavy constructs until necrodermis ran in glowing streams. Hellblasters targeted immortals and destroyers at range. Their plasma incinerators screamed with heat, vents opening after every sustained volley, while warning sigils flickered across armor displays. Blade Guard veterans enclosed the command element behind storm shields, scarred by gas impacts, power swords burning blue in the unnatural darkness. Redemptor dreadnoughts advanced among them like walking bastions, macroplasma incinerators, firing over the heads of the infantry. One ancient warrior inside a sarcophagus crushed a wounded Skorpek beneath its foot and continued forward without slowing. Concentrated gorse fire found him moments later. Blue armor disappeared from the dreadnought's left side in widening patches. Internal mechanisms became visible. The ancient continued firing until half the torso had been stripped away and a final beam penetrated the sarcophagus. The Redemptor stopped in mid-stride, its weapons lowered. Titus passed beneath its shadow without looking back. Gadriel remained visible, even when individual warriors disappeared in smoke. The second company standard rose above him, torn from the previous battles, its blue field scorched and blackened, but unmistakable. Mortal soldiers used it as a directional marker when Vox networks failed. Scattered Astartes squads oriented toward it through the dust. Gadriel fought with one hand on his weapon, and the banner close enough that its weight dragged against his armor whenever artillery shook the ground. A Lockhust destroyer swept low across a ruined transit platform and killed two of the Marines guarding him before either could turn. Its weapon struck the first through the torso, exploding the warrior's back in a cloud of pulverized ceramite, bone and organ matter. The second lost his head to a blast that left molten armor running down the gorget. Gadriel fired upward, but the destroyer struck the platform and sent him against the parapet. The standard tilted. For an instant, it seemed certain to fall. Gadriel seized the shaft with both hands, planted its base beneath the destroyer's repulsor assembly, and used the length of the banner as a lever. Transhuman muscle drove through ceramite limbs. The destroyer tipped sideways, scraped across the parapet, and fell into the street below. Gadriel tore his bolt rifle from its maglock and fired after it until the machine's upper body disappeared beneath explosions. Then he drove the standard into the cracked platform again. "Second company," he said across the Vox, breath harsh but controlled. The standard stands. Form upon it. Blue icons began converging through the tactical haze. Titus did not duel the enemy. He destroyed it. He threw a crack grenade beneath the leg assembly of a Skorpek before entering reach of its blades. The explosion tore one limb away and forced the construct sideways. 3 intercessors concentrated fire on the exposed joint. Only when the destroyer was unbalanced did Titus close, Chainsword driving through the damaged torso, while his heavy bolt pistol fired into the cranial housing. A pair of immortals attempted to flank him. Gadriel's squad broke one with bolter fire. Titus killed the other after it turned toward the greater immediate threat. When a Canoptek Wraith emerged from a wall behind him, a Blade Guard veteran intercepted its first strike with his storm shield, allowing Titus to plant a melter charge against the creature's chest and kick it backward through the wall it had entered. The resulting heat flash left the passage beyond glowing. He did not waste strength proving superiority against intact enemies when damaged ones could be killed faster. He did not seek honorable contests. Every broken machine left functioning behind him was another possibility of reanimation, another weapon that might kill a battle brother later. So he finished them. Heads were crushed under armored boots. Severed torsos received bolt rounds through their command nodes. Crawling destroyers were hacked apart until their limbs could no longer reach one another. The trail of the Second Company was not heroic. It was forensic. Dismembered metal, cratered stone, ruptured human bodies, empty casings, and the black marks left by plasma discharge. The advance reached the Caldan Causeway, with the central tomb entrance still 6 kilometers ahead. There, the Imperial left flank failed. The first warning reached Titus as a cascade of red icons along his helm display. 2 Astra Militarum divisions had held a line through ruined shrine districts and tank manufactoria, but monoliths had materialized behind their artillery reserve and severed the formations from their ammunition columns. Destroyers flooded through the opening. Tens of thousands of loyal troops remained inside the collapsing pocket. If the Necrons broke fully through them, they would strike the Second Company's flank and rear, while Titus remained committed against the tomb defenses. Gadriel saw the projection. They cannot hold. Titus enlarged the tactical geometry. No. Reserve? Already committed. Armor? Destroyed or outside interception range. Green icons spread toward the spearhead. Titus opened a direct channel to the fleet. Silver, I require lance fire on grid Caldan Primus through Caldan Sextus. The Commodore's reply was immediate. That grid contains Imperial formations. I know. Silence followed, filled by the war. How many? Silver asked. Enough that the enemy has committed heavily to killing them. Captain, those soldiers are still fighting, which is why the Necrons remain concentrated around them. Prepare the strike. Mortal command channels erupted before the fleet finished calculating the solution. Colonel Davos of the surviving Caldan Defense Group appeared on Titus's tactical display, his face streaked with blood, the image shaking beneath nearby impacts. Captain, orbital targeting runes have appeared across our sector. Correct. Davos stared at him. Understanding arrived slowly, then all at once. We are still here. Withdraw west immediately. Our western routes are blocked. Then clear them. The colonel looked somewhere beyond the pict feed. Men were shouting behind him. How long? Titus checked Silver's firing solution. 3 minutes. Davos gave a short laugh that sounded more like a cough. 3 minutes to move 30,000 men through a collapsed manufacturum district. You have less now. The colonel's expression changed. Not fear. Resignation hardened into duty. Will the strike stop them? Yes. Davos wiped blood from one eye. Then do not delay because of us. Titus inclined his head once. The channel died. Some tried to escape. Chimera transports reversed through streets filled with wounded. Infantry climbed onto tank hulls until there was no space left to stand. Medici orderlies abandoned stretchers and dragged men by their webbing. Priests remained in the forward trenches,
because there was no room in the vehicles, and because someone had to tell the soldiers why dying beneath Imperial fire was not betrayal. Many did not move at all. They continued firing. Heavy bolters hammered at approaching warriors, while ammunition belts ran dry. A Lehman Russ with a severed track traversed its turret and fired until destroyers reached the hull. Men in a shrine courtyard formed ranks around a regimental standard already burning at the edges. Above them, clouds opened. Gadriel looked back once. Titus did not. The lance strike descended as a line of absolute white. It touched the center of the Caldan pocket and erased distinction. Human tanks, Necron phalanxes, chapels, bunkers, corpse fields, ammunition depots, and entire streets vanished inside the first impact. A second beam struck farther north. The ground heaved upward in a wall of molten stone. Men who had survived the initial strike became silhouettes against the light for a fraction of a second before they ceased to exist. A third lance carved through a monolith concentration and continued deep enough to expose buried Necron architecture beneath the city. The atmosphere itself seemed to burn. Shockwaves reached the second company seconds later and threw loose debris across the causeway. Warning runes filled Titus's visor. The left flank disappeared from the tactical map. Friendly and hostile icons extinguished together. In their place remained a kilometer-wide barrier of fire, collapsed terrain and radiation, severe enough to deny immediate passage. The encirclement had been prevented. 30,000 Imperial troops had become part of the obstacle. Gadriel faced forward again. Caldan is gone. Caldan fulfilled its purpose, Titus said. The words might have sounded monstrous from another commander. From Titus, they were merely an operational fact. Advance. The lance strike did more than seal the flank. It changed the enemy. Necron formations that had maintained their methodical assault halted across multiple sectors. Destroyer packs turned toward the bombardment as though hearing a call beyond Vox or command protocol. Green light intensified within the tomb entrance ahead. The earth shook. Titus raised his chainsword and slowed the advance. A shape moved through the smoke beyond the shattered causeway. Then another. Then hundreds. Destroyers emerged first. Scorpex and Locusts, advancing together in numbers no sane Necron commander would have concentrated so openly beneath Imperial guns. Their formations possessed none of the disciplined geometry of the dynastic phalanxes. They surged like a mechanical plague, blades wet with blood, necrodermis scarred by their own reckless advance. At their center came something larger. Necrosaur Amantar stepped from the smoke. Its body was a monument to corrupted purpose, ancient necrodermis rebuilt around the single imperative of extinction. Barbed limbs curved from its frame, some carrying scraps of human flesh caught from previous kills. A bladed tail dragged across the stone behind it. The Unmaker gauntlet burned around one arm with an emerald radiance that distorted the air. Its skull was elongated, expressionless, yet madness existed in every movement. Where other Necrons advanced with mechanical economy, Amantar seemed barely constrained by its own body, as if it desired to be in all places of slaughter at once. The battlefield changed around its arrival. Destroyers accelerated. Necron warriors abandoned firing discipline and began walking directly into Imperial guns. Somewhere behind Titus, mortal soldiers started praying. Amantar stopped. Across hundreds of meters of burning ground, through smoke, drifting ash, and the wreckage of armies, its green eyes fixed upon Titus. For the first time since Mordain Prime had begun to die, Captain and Necrosaur looked upon one another without hololith, transmission, or intermediary. Titus raised his chainsword. Amantar opened its arms, and the dead came forward. Amantar's arrival did not strengthen the Necron army so much as corrupt the idea of an army around it. The disciplined advance that had ground across Mordain Prime for days began to fracture into something more dangerous than disorder. Warriors that had marched in mathematically perfect ranks abandoned formation and strode directly into Imperial fire. Gauss flares held level, even as battle cannon shells tore apart the phalanxes around them. Immortals left prepared firing positions to pursue retreating infantry into ruins, where their superior range no longer mattered. Lockhurst destroyers skimmed low over the corpse fields, with no regard for crossfire, hunting anything that still moved beneath smoke and orbital ash. Skorpek constructs hurled themselves against tanks head-on, hyperphase blades opening armor from prow to engine compartment before explosions consumed attacker and victim together. Titus watched the change spread outward from the Necrosaur like contamination through blood. Amantar stood at the center of it, barbed limbs dripping human matter, its Unmaker gauntlet pulsing with green radiance, and every Necron near it became less concerned with survival, position, or command. The Destroyer curse had always been madness built around a single conclusion, that all life was an error to be corrected, but around Amantar, that conclusion became contagious urgency. "Captain," Gadriel said over the squad channel, the second company standard visible through the smoke behind him. "Their line is breaking." Titus watched a warrior cohort abandon cover and walk directly into sustained heavy bolter fire. "No," he replied. "It is becoming exactly what Amantar wants." Mataris appeared at Titus's left, blade already wet with oily Necron residue. "And what do you want?" The answer came before Titus had finished calculating it. "Its head." The decapitation strike began with bolter fire. Titus did not charge blindly across the open ground. He marked the densest destroyer concentrations, ordered eradicators to break the heaviest constructs, and sent Blade Guard forward beneath overlapping storm shields. Frag grenades burst among approaching warriors, throwing them from their feet and stripping limbs from bodies already beginning to reknit. Crack charges followed against Skorpek joints. Titus moved only when the enemy screen had begun to tear open, leading a wedge of veterans through a corridor created by disciplined violence. The first destroyer reached them without slowing. A Blade Guard veteran took its hyperphase blade on his shield and lost half the shield, his forearm and most of the flesh beneath the vambrace in the same impact. Titus shot the construct through the knee joint before it could recover, then drove his chainsword into its neck and forced the roaring teeth through living metal, while the wounded veteran finished it with a pistol round through the cranial core. More came. Mataras fought on Titus's right, each movement economical, no wasted flourish in a warrior who had survived too many wars to confuse spectacle with killing. Gadriel held farther back, protecting the company standard and directing fire into the widening breach. Beyond them, Amantar waited. It did not move until Titus came within killing distance. Then it crossed the intervening ground with speed that made its size obscene. Its bladed tail struck first. Veteran Kaldus had just raised his power sword when the tail entered beneath his breastplate, passed through both lungs, and erupted from his back. Amantar wrenched the blade sideways. Kaldus came apart inside his armor, torso splitting open in a burst of blood, ruptured organs and torn fiber bundles, before the tail flung what remained of him into the rubble. Another veteran fired point blank. The Necrosaur's enmitic weapon answered. There was no clean wound. Ceramite buckled inward, then the marine inside it collapsed into red pulp as his armor filled with liquefied flesh and powdered bone. Titus reached Amantar through the blood mist. His first chainsword strike caught one of the Necrosaur's forward limbs and tore strips of necrodermis from the joint, revealing green-lit mechanisms beneath. He followed with his heavy bolt pistol, firing into the exposed assembly until one shell detonated deep enough to stagger the Xenos. For an instant, the Necrosaur seemed surprised that the biological thing before it had inflicted meaningful damage. Then surprise vanished beneath violence. The Unmaker gauntlet struck Titus across the chest. His iron halo ignited in a sphere of white force and collapsed almost instantly under the impact. The blow lifted him from the ground and hurled him through a rockcrete wall. He struck hard enough to crack the structure around his armor, disappeared beneath dust and broken masonry,
and for several seconds his helm filled with warning runes. Left rib plating compromised, secondary power interruption, halo recharge failure, internal bleeding detected. Titus forced himself upright. Amantar was already coming through the wall. The Necrosaur's skull tilted. "Persistent specimen," it said, voice entering the Vox without transmission protocol. "Your death has been delayed beyond utility." Titus raised the chainsword. "Then correct the delay." Amantar attacked again. Titus parried one limb, evaded another, and still failed to see the tail until it struck his pauldron and tore through ceramite. He would have died on the next exchange if Gadriel had not driven a burst of bolt fire into the Necrosaur's damaged limb while Mataurus struck from the opposite side. Amantar turned toward the greater immediate threat, its madness refusing to ignore any living target close enough to destroy. Mataurus bought Titus 3 seconds and paid for them with half his body. He drove his blade through the damaged section Titus had opened, tearing Necrodermis wider and forcing the Necrosaur to twist. Amantar's lower limb came up beneath his guard. The blade entered below Mataurus's right arm and passed through the flank of his armor, cutting through ceramite, fused ribs, transhuman muscle and organs before bursting from his back in a fan of dark blood. The old ultramarine made no sound beyond a grunt. He locked one hand around the limb inside him and fired his bolt pistol into Amantar's torso until the weapon clicked empty. Titus hit the Necrosaur from the side with enough force to wrench the blade free. Mataurus fell. The ground beneath him became red almost immediately. "Apothecary," Titus ordered. A white-armored figure reached the veteran under covering fire, Narthecium already extending. Massive thoracic destruction. Secondary heart compromised. One lung destroyed. Susan response not yet triggered. Titus looked down. Mataurus's eyes remained open. "Go," the old warrior said. Blood gathered at the corner of his mouth. "Do not turn this into another expenditure, merely because I am the one bleeding." Titus said nothing. The apothecary sealed the wound with emergency foam and combat sutures, then dragged Mataurus toward cover with help from a blade guard. Amantar was reforming amid its destroyers. The damage Titus had inflicted was already closing. He watched the Necrosaur turn its skull toward him, almost inviting pursuit. That was when he understood the trap. Amantar wanted rage. It wanted the captain of the Second Company to spend his veterans in a direct contest where every advantage belonged to the Xenos. The Necrosaur had no need to defeat Titus strategically if it could provoke him into reducing the Second Company to corpses beneath the tomb entrance. Titus stopped advancing. "Break contact," he ordered. Gadriel turned his helm toward him. "Captain, we are withdrawing from the Necrosaur. It is wounded and repairing. It wants us close." Titus studied the tactical feed. Destroyer reinforcements were still pouring through translocation arteries beneath the nearby hive district, converging upon Amantar faster than Imperial guns could cut them down. The problem was not the Necrosaur's body. The problem was the infrastructure feeding bodies into the battle around it. Titus enlarged the subterranean map. The largest translocation artery passed beneath Hive District Electo, an ancient mass of manufactoria, hab stacks, and reactor foundations built directly over Necron galleries. "There," he said. Gadriel followed the projection. "The reactor foundation. If it falls, the galleries beneath it collapse. Along with the district." "Yes." The silence that followed carried more weight than shouting could have. Electo still contained millions of civilians and soldiers. The structural calculation took 6 minutes. Tech Marines and Mechanicus adepts agreed reluctantly, because the numbers allowed little room for debate. Electo's primary reactor complex rested upon foundation piers driven kilometers into the lower Hive bedrock. Overloading the reactors, while detonating melter charges along the load-bearing galleries, would collapse the district into the tomb artery beneath it. Billions of tons of rockcrete, steel, machinery, shrines, habitation blocks, and human bodies would fall through the translocation route. The buried Necron galleries would not be permanently destroyed, but they would be sealed long enough to isolate Amantar from the majority of its surface reinforcements. Silver's voice came from orbit. "Evacuation estimate?" A mortal logistics officer answered before Titus could. "At current road capacity, complete clearance would require no less than 7 hours, likely more. Surface routes are under attack." Titus checked the convergence projections. They did not possess 7 hours. 1 hour, he said. The officer stared at him through the hololith. "Captain, there are several million souls inside the district. Then move as many as 1 hour permits. And after? Detonation occurs on schedule." The evacuation began as panic disguised by orders. Every chimera, cargo hauler, civilian crawler, medici vehicle, and functioning transport within reach was redirected toward Alecto. Defense troops cleared arterial roads at gunpoint. Refugees flooded stairwells and transit galleries in numbers too great for any command system to control. Men were crushed against blast gates when frightened crowds surged before the doors fully opened. Parents lifted children above the press until arms failed and bodies vanished beneath thousands of boots. Priests climbed onto vehicle roofs and shouted instructions through Lord Hailers, invoking the Emperor's name because faith remained one of the few tools capable of turning terror into movement. The wounded were loaded first until commanders realized that doing so reduced total evacuation throughput. Then the order changed. Those unable to walk were left in chapel wards with medici attendants and priests who volunteered to remain. Soldiers of the Defense Auxilia stood at intersections directing civilians even after learning that their own extraction priority had been revoked. The chronometer advanced without emotion. 43 minutes, 31, 20. Above the district, Imperial aircraft fought to keep evacuation corridors open, while doom scythes cut through transport columns and left hundreds burning in the streets. Beneath the city, tech marines moved through reactor foundations, planting charges with machine-like precision. No one pretended the city would empty. Gadriel found Titus on an elevated transit platform overlooking the western evacuation artery. Below them, thousands of civilians moved between burning hab blocks while armor columns passed in the opposite direction toward the front. The second company standard hung behind Gadriel, blackened at its edge by heat. "There are 12 minutes remaining," he said. "I know." Gadriel looked down at the crowds. "Will you remember them?" Titus turned. The question carried no accusation of heresy, no challenge to command, no suspicion such as had once existed between them. It was worse because it was trust asking what trust had purchased. "Yes." Gadriel held his gaze. "All of them?" "As many as memory permits." "And when this war ends?" Titus looked again toward the civilians below. A man had fallen. Others climbed over him because stopping would kill more. I remember the refugee transport, the men in the trench line, Kalden, the crew aboard the Necron vessel, every battalion I ordered to remain where survival was impossible. Gadriel said nothing. Titus continued, "Memory does not restore them. It does not absolve me. It only prevents me from lying to myself about the price." "Then why do this again?" "Because if I refuse now, their deaths become merely the beginning of a larger count." He looked toward the chronometer. "Remembering them is precisely why I cannot permit their expenditure to become meaningless." Gadriel lowered his head once. "Then I will remember them as well." At 1 minute, the final warning sounded across Alecto. Some transport columns were still kilometers from safety. Defense officers begged for 5 more minutes, then 3, then 1. Titus denied each request. At 10 seconds, Tech Marines confirmed the melter charges were armed. At 0, Titus gave the order. The reactors overloaded first. Deep beneath the hive, plasma containment failed in a sequence deliberately engineered to become catastrophic. Light burst through foundation shafts. Then the demolition charges fired. Load-bearing galleries vanished into white heat. For a heartbeat, the city remained standing over emptiness. Then gravity took possession of Alecto. Towers kilometers high sank downward. Hab blocks folded into one another. Manufactoria split at their foundations and disappeared through clouds of dust. Roads snapped like parchment. Churches, transit stations, defense bunkers, civilian shelters, Necron constructs, tanks and men all descended together. Those still on the streets had time to understand only that the ground was gone. Entire crowds vanished into collapsing avenues. Vehicles tumbled end over end into darkness. A cathedral spire leaned across 3 habitation towers before all 4 structures broke apart beneath their own mass. Deep below, the falling city struck the translocation galleries. Billions of tons of architecture crushed black metal chambers, buried portals, and severed energy conduits. Necrons caught beneath the collapse were ground into fragments too scattered for immediate resurrection. Human bodies became indistinguishable from the rubble that killed them. The shockwave reached Titus beyond the evacuation line as a rolling wall of dust. His armor locked automatically against the impact. Gadriel disappeared for several seconds inside the cloud, the company standard becoming only a shadow. When visibility returned, Hive District Alecto no longer existed. In its place lay a vast depression of broken towers and exposed darkness. Green energy flickered far below, where the collapsed city had torn open the oldest layers of the tomb world. Tactical feeds began updating. Destroyer reinforcement markers vanished by the hundreds. Translocation activity fell almost to nothing across the central front. Amentar remained above ground, but most of the army feeding its advance had been cut away from it. Then the dust shifted. Beneath the ruins, a structure emerged that no Imperial survey had ever recorded. A gate rose from the wound in the world, so vast that its upper arch stood higher than surviving Hab spires. Beyond it descended a roadway of black metal, wide enough for entire armored regiments, vanishing into green-lit depths beneath Mordain Prime. The oldest tomb complex had been exposed. Titus watched the darkness beyond the entrance for several seconds. Then he opened the company Vox. All surviving veterans, form on my position. Terminator elements and Tech Marines to the front. Ammunition expenditure to be replenished from nearest available stock. Apothecaries recover gene seed from those who cannot continue. Gadriel approached through settling ash. The convergence lies below. Yes. And Amentar? Titus looked toward the distant front, where the Necrosaur's green silhouette still moved among the smoke. It will follow. Gadriel planted the standard beside him. Then we assault the tomb. Titus drew his chainsword and watched its teeth begin to turn. There will be no second assault, he said. We end the convergence now, or we die beneath the world. The war above them continued without witnesses. Artillery shook the upper foundations of Mordain Prime. Voidcraft burned in the poisoned skies. Armored regiments died across continents, and millions of men continued killing because orders issued hours earlier had not yet been rescinded. But beneath the ruins of Hive Alecto, all of that immensity narrowed to a single descending road of black metal and fewer than 100 warriors. Titus crossed the threshold first. Gadriel came behind him, with the torn standard of the second company furled against its pole so that the ancient fabric would not catch upon the alien architecture. Terminators advanced in 2 files along the flanks, storm bolters tracking the darkness ahead. Blade Guard veterans occupied the center with shields raised. Eradicators carried melter rifles whose capacitors glowed against the black, and the Tech Marines followed among servo skulls, demolition servitors, and equipment burdens whose machine spirits had been prepared for corruption through rites of isolation. Apothecaries moved last, because every warrior who fell in those depths represented not merely another dead space marine, but centuries of genetic inheritance that could not be surrendered while recovery remained possible. Behind the column, the immense gate of the tomb remained open upon a sky filled with ash. Far beyond it, Imperial artillery flashed red against the clouds. Then the road curved downward, the surface vanished, and mankind entered a place that had been old before terror possessed oceans recognizable to human memory. The first kilometer obeyed enough physical laws to be mistaken for architecture. The second did not. A staircase descended from the wall to Titus's left, continued beneath the floor, and then reappeared upside down across the ceiling without any apparent interruption. A chamber measured 70 meters across, according to his helm optics, and more than 600 according to the tech marine walking beside him. Both readings persisted simultaneously. Gravity failed in one corridor and returned sideways in the next, throwing loose ammunition, fragments of necrodermis, and one combat servitor against a wall with bone-crushing force. The Astartes compensated without discussion. Magnetic locks engaged. Squad intervals tightened. Route-marking beacons were driven into the black surfaces at every junction, even when the tomb attempted to absorb them. Ancient glyphs covered some galleries from floor to impossible ceiling, depicting ranks of skeletal warriors marching beneath stars that no imperial chart recognized, fighting creatures whose bodies had been erased by 10,000 generations of extinction. One mural showed suns enclosed inside lattices, and immense beings bending toward them as though feeding. Gadriel looked at it for less than a heartbeat. "Record and continue," Titus said. A tech marine acknowledged. There would be time to wonder at the dead empire if they survived it. Until then, every unknown shape was terrain, every light source a possible weapon, and every unopened passage an enemy approach. The Canoptech Guardians arrived in silence. The floor ahead opened without seam or hinge and released a swarm of scarabs, thick enough to resemble liquid metal. Storm bolters opened immediately. Bolt shells burst through the front ranks, scattering fragments across the passage, but the swarm merely flowed around its own dead. Flamers washed the corridor in promethium. Hundreds of scarabs vanished beneath burning chemical fire, while hundreds more climbed over them. Then larger shapes came through the walls. Wraiths passed through solid necrodermis and struck directly into the Terminator line, claws appearing inside the dimensional thickness of armor before completing their passage into reality. One veteran caught a wraith with a power fist and crushed half its thorax against the wall. Another took 3 claws through his breastplate and continued firing his storm bolter into the creature's skull until both disappeared behind.
Detonations. "Heavy contacts, rear left," Gadriel called. An Eradicator turned and fired. Melter energy struck a Canoptech construct as large as a battle tank and converted its forward body into incandescent fluid. The heat scorched blue armor 20 meters away. Titus fired his heavy bolt pistol into scarabs clinging to the leg of a Terminator, each shot tearing holes through the mass until the warrior could stamp the remaining machines into the deck. Not all of them were removed in time. Brother Sarnus reported pressure loss inside his right greave. Then armor telemetry began registering failures along his thigh and hip. Scarabs had entered through a crack opened during the surface fighting. They were inside his plate. The veteran dropped to one knee, while metallic shapes moved beneath torn fiber bundles, cutting at cables, seals, and flesh with the same minute mandibles. An apothecary reached him while the battle still raged. "Remain immobile. I remain combat capable. You remain infected." The apothecary drove a cutting tool through the damaged armor without waiting for further permission. Ceramite came away in sections. Blood followed. Scarabs spilled from the opening trailing strips of Sarnus's muscle between their limbs. The apothecary burned them with a surgical laser, then cut deeper when his auto-senses detected more beneath the tissue. Sarnus's fist tightened against the floor hard enough to crack black stone, but he made no other movement. A wraith phased through the wall beside them. Titus intercepted it, chainsword striking across the neck assembly, while Gadriel's bolter fire tore through its lower body. The apothecary continued operating as metal fragments and blood crossed his white armor. "Debridement complete," he said at last. "Motor function reduced." Sarnus stood.
Then I shall kill more slowly. Titus turned toward the next corridor. Do not. They descended farther, and perception itself began to fail. Titus saw Gadriel enter a doorway before Gadriel had reached it. A moment later, the image repeated, and the real warrior crossed exactly where the apparition had. A Terminator appeared upon the Auspex 10 meters behind the formation, though Titus could see the same veteran walking directly ahead of him. The false contact remained for 30 seconds before vanishing. Muzzle flashes sometimes appeared before weapons fired. Corpses seemed to stand where living warriors had died moments later, as though time inside the tomb leaked forward and backward through cracks no human sense could detect. Warp disturbance? Gadriel asked. Cornelius was not with them, but a tech marine answered through the squad channel. Negative. No empiric signature detected. Titus saw a Blade Guard veteran reflected in a black wall. In the reflection, the warrior's head was missing. Titus looked away. The veteran remained alive. Catan influence, the tech marine continued. Localized distortion of photonic propagation and temporal sequence cannot be excluded. Then exclude nothing, Titus said. Visual confirmation supersedes Auspex. No warrior fires upon a contact, seen only through instrumentation. Confirm with 2 sets of eyes before engagement. Gadriel glanced toward the wall. And if our eyes disagree? Kill whichever version attacks first. The dimensional gate took 11 warriors. They were crossing a chamber whose center contained a suspended ring of black stone when the ring activated without warning. A wall of green distortion passed through the formation, separating Squadcaster from the rest of the strike force. Titus turned immediately. The 11 intercessors remained visible beyond the barrier, but their images stretched and compressed as if seen through deep water. A tech marine approached the field, scanning. Dimensional partition. Unknown destination differential. Can you open it? Possibly. Time? No reliable estimate. Necron contacts appeared on both sides of the gate. Warriors emerged behind Squadcaster, while Canoptech signals gathered ahead of Titus's force. Gadriel raised his weapon. We can hold. Titus looked at the convergence marker pulsing deeper beneath the planet. There was no time. He opened the squad channel. Castor, you are cut off. Sergeant Castor answered without hesitation. Confirmed, Captain. Hold your side of the gate. Destroy anything attempting passage. Do not attempt to follow unless the field collapses naturally. Castor understood the sentence hidden inside the order. By your command. Titus turned away. The squad's bolters began firing behind them. Minutes later, the reports became intermittent. 6 warriors neutralized, 2 immortals advancing, static. Brother Tarsus fallen, ammunition at 42 rounds, more static. Titus continued walking. Destroyer contact, ammunition at 21. The voice became harsher beneath weapons discharge. 7. Then there were only individual shots spaced several seconds apart. 3. A final burst sounded. The channel died. No one in the strike force spoke their names. The dead had purchased time, and the living were already spending it. Amantar's passage became visible before the Necrosaur itself. Dynastic Necrons lay dismembered along the galleries, their bodies torn apart with a savagery that had nothing to do with Imperial weapons. Some had been cut into pieces and driven into the walls. Others remained partially functional, green optics flickering as they attempted resurrection without sufficient limbs to assemble themselves. Destroyers lay among them, equally ruined. Amantar had not distinguished servant from obstruction. Farther ahead, the corruption became worse. Human corpses taken from the surface had been carried into the tomb and flayed. Skins hung from angular machinery where no Necron ritual should have required them. Beneath the trophies stood cryptex, whose bodies had been rebuilt into grotesque configurations. One possessed 6 segmented arms, each terminating in cutting implements taken from destroyer constructs. Another had replaced its lower body with a cluster of bladed limbs and crawled along the wall rather than the floor.
Their modifications were not elegant expressions of cryptech mastery, but mutilations, physical evidence of minds dragged into the same exterminatory obsession that infected Amantar. One of them turned toward the Ultramarines and emitted a burst of code that translated imperfectly as laughter. Hellblaster fire removed its upper body before it could finish. Titus looked upon the remains. The cryptech in Hive Enoch called Amantar a disease. Gadriel fired once into the skull of a second corrupted cryptech. It underestimated the infection. The first sight of the convergence chamber stopped even the Astartes. The gallery opened onto a void so vast that Titus's optics could not establish its far wall. Structures the size of hive towers hung upside down beneath distant surfaces. Bridges crossed emptiness toward platforms arranged around a central geometry that refused to remain a single shape when viewed directly. 3 containment systems had been dragged from separate regions of the tomb and forced into proximity around that nexus. Within them moved shadows, not darkness caused by absent light, but shapes that consumed illumination at their boundaries. One resembled a tall, robed figure seen from an impossible distance. Another possessed only the suggestion of wings or a cloak spreading across stars. The third was a black curve like the edge of a scythe passing behind reality. They circled one another slowly. Every human body in the chamber reacted before intellect could intervene. Mortal serfs attached to the Tech Marine equipment column collapsed, vomiting into their respirators. One combat servitor entered a neurological seizure, despite possessing almost no independent mind. Even the Astartes felt it. Titus's twin hearts accelerated. His muscles prepared for flight before centuries of discipline crushed the impulse. It was not psychic terror. No voice whispered inside his skull. Something older lived beneath the response, a memory encoded into biological existence from an age when the Nightbringer's image had seeded fear of death across species too primitive to know why darkness frightened them. Convergence is significantly more advanced than projection, a Tech Marine reported. Even his machine-filtered voice had tightened. Servo arms unfolded from his back as he examined the structures through multiple spectrums. Containment systems are no longer independent. Energy is crossing between all 3. Titus looked toward the central nexus. Can the machinery be destroyed? The Tech Marine remained silent for several seconds. Yes. Then prepare charges. Negative recommendation. Titus turned. Explain. The Tech Marine projected a schematic filled with warning runes. The containment structures are damaged, but still restraining the entities. Destruction of the primary lattice will not destroy the shards. It will release them. Gadriel looked toward the circling shadows. Then separation. Possible. The convergence mechanism can be destabilized by severing 3 synchronization nodes. Once separation is achieved, surviving Tesseract systems may be activated individually. May? Titus asked. Necron technology does not respect certainty merely because we desire it. The Tech Marine marked a control nexus on a distant platform. Manual intervention required there. Simultaneous disruption required here and here. The fragments must be forced apart before containment can reassert. Titus studied the routes. And Amantar? Its command protocols appear integrated into the convergence. If the Necrosaur reaches the central nexus first, it may complete the process. The answer came from above them. Stone exploded from one of the elevated galleries. Destroyers poured through the breach, Scorpex dropping from impossible heights without concern for impact, while Lockhurst forms swept over the platforms behind them. Storm bolters thundered. Eradicators fired melter volleys into the first wave. Blade Guard locked shields and met the charge. Titus saw one veteran driven backward with a hyperphase blade buried through his abdomen, then kill the destroyer responsible by forcing his power sword through its skull, while both fell from the platform. Tech Marines continue preparation, Titus ordered. Everyone else holds. Gadriel unfurled the standard and drove its base into the platform. The torn banner opened above the convergence chamber,
impossibly small against the vast Necron structures. Then Amantar descended. The Necrosaur dropped from the upper gallery amid its own destroyers and struck the platform hard enough to fracture the surface. Titus met it before it could reach the Tech Marines. His chainsword struck one bladed limb and tore sparks from necrodermis. Amantar's tail snapped past his helm and killed a blade guard behind him by entering through the eye lens and exiting the back of the skull. The corpse remained upright for half a second before collapsing around the embedded blade. Gadriel fired into the Necrosaur's flank. Amantar turned, Unmaker gauntlet blazing. A figure hit it from the opposite side. Mataras should not have been there. The veteran's armor was sealed beneath crude emergency plating, one side of his torso reinforced with medici braces and augmetic supports. Blood had already seeped around the repairs. An apothecary followed behind him, shouting an order Mataras had plainly ignored. The old ultramarine drove his blade into the Necrosaur's damaged limb. "You are difficult to leave unsupervised," he told Titus. "You were ordered to remain under treatment." I disagreed. Amantar struck. Mataras barely caught the blow against his weapon, the impact driving him to one knee. Titus attacked the opening, heavy bolt pistol firing into the same damaged joint they had wounded on the surface. Gadriel joined from the flank. For several brutal seconds, the three Ultramarines forced Amantar away from the Tech Marines, not overpowering it, but occupying every limb, every weapon, and every murderous calculation with immediate threats. Then the chamber changed. One of the containment shadows touched another. Reality folded. Titus felt the impact before he saw it. A wave of force crossed the platform and threw warriors in every direction. The iron halo flashed around him. Gadriel disappeared inside green light. Titus struck something hard, rolled, and felt gravity reverse beneath his armor. He fell upward through a dimensional field that had not existed a heartbeat before. Gadriel collided with him. Both crashed onto another platform as the field sealed behind them in a wall of black-green energy. Titus rose. Across the barrier, the rest of the second company fought beneath flickering light. He could see Mataras, the Tech Marines, and the surviving veterans, but their Vox signals had become meaningless static. The field divided the chamber from floor to impossible ceiling. Gadriel stood beside him and raised his bolt rifle. Ahead, Amantar dragged itself upright from the same dimensional convulsion. Beyond the Necrosaur, the three shadows of the Nightbringer moved closer together. Titus activated his chainsword. They were alone with death. Amantar moved before the last echoes of the dimensional collapse had faded. There was no proclamation, no challenge, and no pause in which hatred might be given words. The Necrosaur crossed the platform in a burst of impossible speed, bladed limbs striking from three directions, while its tail whipped low across the black stone. Titus met the first attack with his chainsword and felt the weapon kick violently in both hands as adamantine teeth screamed against hyperphase-edged necrodermis. Gadriel was already moving. He stepped left, fired a disciplined burst into Amantar's cranial housing, and forced the Necrosaur to turn one arm toward him. Titus used the opening immediately, driving his shoulder into the alien's torso and cutting at the same joint they had damaged on the surface. The chainsword bit, tore free, and bit again. Amantar answered with the Unmaker gauntlet. The weapon did not strike like a fist. Reality around it came apart. The edge of the platform vanished where the gauntlet passed, black stone separating into incandescent dust, and then into nothing visible at all. Titus twisted aside by less than the width of his breastplate. The wake of the blow caught his left arm and stripped armor from the vambrace in glowing layers. Warning runes flared across his visor. Gadriel fired again, not at the Necrosaur's center mass, but into one of the rear joints supporting the tail. Amantar turned toward him. Titus struck. Gadriel moved. Their rhythm required no command. They had fought beside one another through too much death to waste language on what muscle memory already understood. Neither attempted to overpower the Necrosaur.
They fought instead to deny it direction, to keep its body turning, to force each murderous limb to answer a threat before it could reach the convergence controls behind them. The Unmaker gauntlet carved through matter wherever it passed. When Titus parried too late, the field around the weapon caught the upper edge of his pauldron and peeled away ceramite, heraldry, and internal plating without heat or impact. The armor simply ceased to exist along a curved line. His shoulder guard hung loose, attached by damaged fiber bundles that sparked with every movement. Amantar's enmitic projector was worse in a different way. The Necrosaur fired into the deck rather than at Gadriel, and the black stone exploded into a storm of molecular fragments, accelerated faster than shrapnel from any conventional charge. The debris struck Gadriel's shield, pauldron, and helm in 1,000 impacts, punching tiny craters into ceramite and driving him backward. One fragment entered beneath the edge of his gorget. Blood ran immediately down the front of his breastplate. He ignored it and shot through the cloud, forcing Amantar to raise an arm against the burst. The tail came for Titus independently, moving before the rest of the Necrosaur had finished turning. Its blade entered beneath his damaged right pauldron, penetrated the armor seal, and drove deep into the muscle above his ribs. Titus caught the limb beneath one arm before it could rip sideways. Pain flooded his nervous system, sharp enough to become clarity. His armor registered blood loss, tissue damage, and a widening pressure failure. He trapped the tail harder against his body, drew his pistol with the other hand, and fired into the segmented joint until the Necrosaur tore itself free. Blood poured down Titus's side, entered his greave, and collected inside the boot seal. He could feel it sloshing around his foot when he moved. The sensation was irrelevant. Pain was information. It indicated damage, location, and changing capability. It did not possess authority. Amantar struck him across the chest with enough force to lift him from the platform. The iron halo ignited. White light burst around Titus and absorbed the first fraction of impact before overload alarms screamed through his helm. He struck the floor on his back, slid through fragments of shattered necrodermis, and rolled as the Necrosaur's next blow split the stone where his skull had been. Gadriel attacked from behind. His blade carved across Amantar's spine, while bolt rounds detonated inside exposed mechanisms. The Necrosaur twisted so quickly that Gadriel barely intercepted the returning limb. His storm shield took the impact and fractured along one edge. Titus regained his feet and went back to the damaged limb. He had marked the weakness since the surface battle. Every strike landed within handspans of the last. The master-crafted chainsword was not designed for delicate work. Its teeth tore. Its motor screamed. Sparks burst from the housing as resistance increased. Titus struck once, withdrew, and struck again. A tooth shattered and ricocheted from his breastplate. Another lodged inside the wound in Amantar's limb before snapping free. Heat warnings appeared across the weapon display. He ignored them. The Necrosaur tried to retreat half a step to change angle. Gadriel forced it back with bolter fire. Titus drove the chainsword into the same groove and held the trigger down. The motor shrieked. The teeth chewed through ancient living metal one brutal fraction at a time. Amantar's limb finally separated with a burst of green light and spinning fragments. Titus caught the severed appendage before it struck the deck and rammed the broken edge straight into the Necrosaur's torso. For the first time, Amantar recoiled. Not from pain as a human understood it, but from damage significant enough to interrupt the geometry of its movement. Green light spilled from the wound. Internal mechanisms attempted to flow closed around the foreign limb embedded in its body. Titus drove it deeper. Gadriel fired into the gap. Bolt shells detonated beneath the necrodermis and opened the wound further. Amantar's head snapped toward Titus. Biological persistence, it said, the words entering his vox through no channel he could close. Meaningless repetition. Titus twisted the severed limb. Then why are you still repairing yourself?
The answer was violence. The Unmaker gauntlet struck his chest. The iron halo flared brighter than before and failed. The field collapsed with a detonation of light so intense that Titus's auto-senses darkened his vision. The blow drove him through the platform surface and into the raised structure behind it. Ceramite shattered across his breastplate. Internal braces snapped. He felt at least one rib crack, despite the reinforced density of Astartes' bone. Amantar followed him into the crater. The Necrosaur seized his breastplate with 2 remaining limbs and began pulling. Armor groaned. The Aquila split down the center. Fiber bundles tore from mounting points and whipped across Titus's chest like severed tendons. One bladed limb punched through the lower plate and entered his abdomen. His body reacted with a convulsion his discipline could not suppress. Blood flooded into the broken armor shell. The Necrosaur pushed deeper. Titus locked both hands around the limb, but could not stop it. Amantar was stronger. Not marginally, categorically. Titus's armor warned of catastrophic internal trauma. Another fraction of movement would open organs from hip to sternum. Then Gadriel struck from behind. He hit Amantar with the full weight of his armor and drove his broken shield edge into the wound Titus had opened. The Necrosaur released one hand from Titus and backhanded Gadriel hard enough to hurl him across the platform. He struck a control column, and the black structure fractured behind him. Gadriel fell to one knee. His left arm hung at an angle no intact limb should possess. Amantar turned to finish him. Titus used the movement. The broken Necron limb he had severed still lay partly embedded in the Necrosaur's torso. He trapped it beneath his forearm, planted one boot against Amantar's lower body, and pulled with every functioning muscle in his back and shoulders. The severed appendage acted as a lever inside the damaged frame. Necrodermis tore wider. Internal supports snapped. The Necrosaur staggered just enough for Titus to wrench himself off the blade, penetrating his abdomen. Blood followed in a heavy sheet. He fell, rolled, rose again. Gadriel had already forced his dislocated arm back against his side and fired with the other. Neither warrior spoke. There was no need. Then one of the shadows broke free. The containment system above them opened with no sound at all. A shape unfolded through the chamber, like darkness remembering it had once possessed a body. The robed void of the Nightbringer shard manifested above the convergence lattice, its outline so vast that scale became meaningless. The suggestion of a skeletal face emerged within the hood, not bone, but an absence shaped like bone. Around it, reality weakened. Necron warriors on the far side of
The dimensional barrier stopped moving. Their green optics flickered and died. Several collapsed into heaps of inert metal without visible damage. A destroyer raised its weapon toward the shard and liquefied from the head downward, necrodermis pouring across the floor in silver-black streams before becoming brittle and cracking apart. Human flesh reacted differently. A wounded ultramarine lying beyond the barrier aged inside his armor. Titus saw skin tighten across the marine's face through a shattered helm lens, then sink inward as the body withered. The warrior's teeth loosened, his eyes clouded. Within seconds, the transhuman giant inside the plate had become a desiccated corpse, sealed within ceramite that remained almost untouched. The shard did not choose sides. It did not recognize loyal servant, traitor machine, noble purpose, or corrupted obsession. Everything beneath it was matter. Everything living beneath it was temporary. Amantar looked upward and stopped fighting. That pause told Titus more than any intercepted transmission. The Necrosaur did not fear the manifestation. It desired it. Every damaged protocol, every violation of dynastic command, every slaughter committed without tactical reason had converged upon this moment. Amantar stepped toward the shard. The movement possessed something almost devotional in its certainty. Titus understood at once. The Necrosaur's greatest weakness was not damage. It was worship distorted into exterminatory fixation. "Gadriel," Titus said. The ancient looked toward him. Titus did not explain the entire plan. "The control nexus. Reach it."
Gadriel followed his gaze to the black structure beyond the dimensional barrier. On the far side, Tech Marines were fighting to restore synchronization nodes, while Mataris and the surviving veterans held destroyers away from them. Gadriel understood. He moved toward the failing barrier. Titus moved the opposite direction, placing himself between Amantar and the manifested shard. The Necrosaur attacked him immediately. Titus gave ground. He had spent the battle refusing retreat. Now retreat became the weapon. He fired into Amantar's damaged torso and backed across the platform toward the containment lattice. The Necrosaur followed, every movement pulled by the shard beyond Titus, as much as driven by hatred for the biological obstruction before it. Titus did not attempt to stop it. He guided it. Each time Amantar angled away from the route, Titus struck the damaged limb and forced its attention back toward him. The enmitic projector fired. Stone became a cloud of lethal fragments. Titus crossed behind a raised control structure and let the molecular storm strip the structure apart instead of his armor. The tail struck again, entering his left thigh through a weakened seal. He trapped it, tore free, and kept moving. Blood filled the second leg of his armor. His foot slipped once inside the greave. He corrected. The convergence field lay behind him now, a circle of green-black energy marked by 3 containment pylons that the Tech Marines had been attempting to reactivate. Across the dimensional barrier, Gadriel reached the damaged control nexus. The barrier flickered as Citan energy distorted it. For a fraction of a second, he passed through rather than around it, his armor outlined in green fire. He slammed against the controls on the far side, found the manual interfaces the Tech Marines had marked, and drove his gauntlet into the first activation recess. Nothing happened. He struck it again. A rune changed. 1 containment pylon awakened. Amantar saw it. The Necrosaur tried to turn away from Titus and toward Gadriel. Titus launched himself forward, wrapped both arms around Amantar's damaged torso, and locked his gauntlets into the torn necrodermis. The Necrosaur reacted with immediate fury. 1 limb entered Titus's side beneath the broken breastplate. Another drove into his back. The tail wrapped around his leg and cut through the armor at the knee. Titus's visor filled with red warnings until almost no clear space remained. Blood surged from wounds his enhanced physiology could seal only slowly. Amantar pulled against him. Titus held. "Second node!" A Tech Marine voice broke through the static. Gadriel struck the controls again. Amantar tore another section from Titus's breastplate. Ceramite ripped away and exposed flesh beneath. The Necrosaur's blade entered his abdomen for the second time and drew upward. Titus felt muscle divide. His grip loosened for half a heartbeat. He tightened it again. Third node unstable. Titus dragged Amantar half a step deeper into the containment field. The Necrosaur struck his head. His visor cracked. 1 lens died. The impact should have rendered him unconscious. Instead, Titus saw blackness for a second, and then light returned in 1 eye. He still had his arms around the enemy. That was enough. "Gadriel," he said, though he did not know whether the channel remained intact. The Ancient looked across the barrier. Titus gave 1 word. "Now." Gadriel drove both hands into the control assembly and forced the final activation sequence. The convergence chamber became white. Containment pylons fired simultaneously. The Nightbringer shard convulsed above them, its immense silhouette stretching across the chamber as if the universe itself were resisting the attempt to give it boundaries. The robed void bent toward the tesseract structure. The suggestion of the scythe swept across the air and cut 3 Necron warriors apart without touching them. Then the field took hold. Darkness folded inward. The shard shrank, not physically but dimensionally, collapsing through angles Titus's mind could not follow. Amantar screamed. It was the first truly emotional sound Titus had heard from the Necrosaur. Not pain, loss. The dimensional implosion caught the alien while Titus still held it. Necrodermis tore away from Amantar in burning sheets. 1 limb stretched impossibly long, then separated into a trail of green particles.
The tail vanished at its midpoint. The Necrosaur's torso opened around the wound Titus had spent the entire battle creating. Internal structures became visible, then twisted sideways through space and disappeared. Titus released his grip only when the force threw him backward. He struck the far platform and slid through blood that was mostly his own. Where Amantar had stood, fragments of necrodermis burned with emerald fire. Some dissolved into nothing. Others disappeared in sudden flashes of translocation energy. There was no intact body, no cranial core, no proof that the Necrosaur's deathless consciousness had been destroyed. Above them, the Nightbringer shard collapsed into the tesseract structure. The containment field sealed. For one impossible moment, silence filled the chamber. Then the tomb began to die. Cracks raced across the platforms. Entire towers of black architecture broke loose and fell upward into darkness. The dimensional barrier vanished. Gadriel reached Titus first, dragging him upright, while the surviving tech marines transmitted catastrophic structural warnings. Mataris appeared beyond them, barely standing, one side of his armor slick with blood. "Captain," a tech marine reported, "primary convergence has failed. Planetary crust destabilization is accelerating. Extraction window measured in minutes." Titus looked toward the remaining control projections. "Are all convergence nodes destroyed?" A pause. "Primary nodes confirmed. 2 subordinate pathways remain unverified." Gadriel tightened his grip on Titus's arm. "We have minutes. Then use them." "Captain." Titus pulled free and reached for his chainsword. The weapon's housing was cracked, several teeth missing, the motor barely functioning. He activated it anyway. The blade coughed, caught, then began to turn. "Victory is meaningless if the enemy begins again tomorrow," Titus said. The tomb collapsed around them. "Find the remaining nodes." The last convergence node died beneath Titus's boot, while Mordain Prime collapsed around him. The machine was no larger than a sarcophagus, a black geometric mass embedded within the tomb wall and pulsing with the same diseased green light that had bound the Nightbringer fragments together. A tech marine had identified its purpose through a storm of corrupted telemetry, while the floor split beneath them, and slabs of necrodermis the size of buildings fell soundlessly into impossible depths. Titus did not wait for a perfect diagnosis. He emptied the remainder of his heavy bolt pistol into the node until explosive shells cracked the outer casing, then drove his ruined chainsword into the opening. The motor screamed. Half its teeth were missing. The remaining adamantine blades caught against mechanisms older than humanity and tore themselves apart along with them. Green fire erupted across Titus's armor. His visor went black for a heartbeat. When vision returned, the node had ceased pulsing. "Confirmed," the tech marine reported through a Vox channel drowning beneath structural alarms. "All identified convergence pathways terminated. No active synchronization signal remains." Only then did Titus turn toward escape. The tomb had already begun sealing its own death around them. Corridors folded shut. Gravity reversed without warning. Bridges fractured beneath the surviving ultramarines, while ancient towers broke from distant surfaces and fell sideways through geometries no human mind could reconcile. Gadriel carried the second company standard beneath one arm and supported a wounded blade guard with the other. Mataris moved through sheer refusal, one side of his armor locked rigid by medici braces, each step leaving dark drops behind him. Apothecaries carried recovered gene seed in stasis canisters, mag-locked against their plate. The dead who could not be carried were left where they had fallen. There was no ceremony. The living had minutes. They escaped through a transit artery, already collapsing beneath the weight of Hive Electo's ruins. The road by which they had entered was gone, buried beneath billions of tons of broken city, but demolition telemetry identified a maintenance aperture opened by the collapse. Terminators widened it with power fists, while tech marines burned through obstructing necrodermis. Behind them came the sound of the tomb tearing itself apart. Not an explosion, but a deep vibration that passed through armor and bone
until even transhuman organs struggled to maintain rhythm. A dimensional fracture opened across the rear of the formation and swallowed 3 wounded intercessors without light, scream, or residue. Titus did not order a search. There was nowhere to search. A kilometer farther on, scarabs poured from a dying wall and covered one apothecary from the knees downward. Gadriel burned them away with a fallen flamer, while the apothecary continued carrying his gene seed burden rather than drop it. When they finally reached the fractured surface, daylight did not greet them. Mordain Prime remained beneath the artificial darkness generated by the Necron systems, though the black sky had begun to fracture into streaks of natural light as the enemy network failed. Titus climbed through a canyon that had once been a Hab Avenue and stood upon the bones of a city. Victory had no banners waiting for him. Entire districts of Mordain Prime burned from horizon to horizon. Towers lay across one another in layers, their upper kilometers snapped away by orbital bombardment or the collapse of the tomb structures beneath them. Mountains visible beyond the city had been divided by lance fire, their slopes glowing where stone had been fused into glass. The air was thick with ash, propellant residue, pulverized rockcrete, and the sweet rot of bodies exposed beneath heat. Millions of dead remained where they had fallen, because no force on the planet possessed enough hands, vehicles, or time to recover them. Trenches were still filled with men killed during the 18-hour defense. Wrecked tanks stood with corpses burned into crew positions. Bodies lay in evacuation streets, where crowds had been crushed before Alecto fell. Other dead had left nothing at all. Gauss fire had reduced whole squads to scorched outlines and dropped weapons. Orbital lance strikes had erased entire regiments so thoroughly that the Administratum would list them as destroyed without ever identifying individual remains. A Defense Auxilia recovery detail passed Titus carrying black body sacks on a tracked cart. The men stopped when they recognized the Ultramarines. None cheered. One made the sign of the Aquila. Another simply stared. Titus walked past them toward the surviving command zone. The Administratum had begun counting before the fires were extinguished. Temporary strategium structures had been erected inside a reinforced munition depot, spared by the bombardment, and there mortal adepts converted apocalypse into records. Servo skulls drifted between cogitator banks, carrying casualty slates. Titus entered the principal mortal command shelter without herald or honor guard. Men stood when they saw him, though some required assistance. Sergeant Marius Venn was among them. Titus recognized the mortal from battlefield records rather than face, for Venn looked less like the
soldier who had begun the 18-hour defense than something recovered from a grave. One ear was bandaged, his left arm hung in a sling. Dried blood had turned the front of his fatigues almost black. Around him stood survivors assembled from several Defense Auxilia and Astra Militarum formations, men whose units existed now only as administrative remnants. They stared at Titus with the complicated expression he had learned to recognize across centuries of Imperial war. Reverence remained because he was an ultramarine captain, an angel of death, one of the Emperor's transhuman warriors. Hatred remained because his voice had ordered them to stand in trenches until almost everyone beside them was dead. Some lowered their heads, others did not. Titus demanded neither. "Status," he said. Venn seemed surprised that the question had been directed toward him. "Western line holds. What remains of it? Necron surface movement has fallen sharply since the tomb collapse. We still have isolated constructs in the ruins. Scarabs mostly. Some warriors. Ammunition? Low. Food?" Venn gave the smallest bitter smile. "Lower." Titus looked across the wounded men. "Then ammunition receives priority until resistance is suppressed." One soldier near the rear laughed once under his breath. Venn turned on him, but Titus raised a gauntlet. "Let him." The soldier stared at the captain. "My regiment is gone because you told us to hold." "Yes. My brother was in Calden."
Then he died when I ordered the lance strike. The room became silent. The soldier's face tightened. Titus continued before anger could turn into a plea for meaning. Both orders prevented the enemy from reaching the convergence chamber before we could destroy it. I will not ask you to be grateful for that. The man looked away. Titus turned back to Ven. Your surviving troops will be rearmed and consolidated. You have done your duty. You are not yet finished. Mordain Prime remained Imperial, according to every report transmitted beyond the system. The statement was technically correct, in the same way a corpse could technically remain in possession of its clothing. 3 hive regions were considered permanently uninhabitable. Agricultural output from the continental plains had fallen so far that relief shipments would be required merely to prevent famine among survivors. Helicon's orbital industry had lost dockyards, refineries, and manufactoria, whose reconstruction would consume decades if the Imperium ever found enough resources to begin. Great sections of the planet had been quarantined because Auspec's returns still indicated dormant architecture beneath them. Nobody could guarantee that the tomb complexes destroyed during the campaign represented all that lay beneath Mordain Prime. The Necrons had slept there for epochs without mankind knowing. They could sleep elsewhere still. Entire provinces were marked forbidden pending Mechanicus survey, meaning millions of survivors would never return home. The Imperium had saved the Reach from immediate annihilation and inherited a wounded system whose continued survival would consume ships, food, labor, and soldiers for generations. Titus read the assessment once. He found nothing unusual about it. Most Imperial victories resembled defeat examined from farther away. Mataras survived because killing him had proved more difficult than the Medici prognosticators predicted. Titus found the veteran inside a temporary apothecarian established aboard the Righteous Fury, seated upright despite orders that his body remain in stasis rest. Much of the armor had been removed from his right side. Synthetic tissue sealed the wound where Amantar's blade had passed through him, and augmetic support structures now reinforced ribs and organs, too damaged to regenerate completely. "You should be unconscious," Titus said. Mataras looked toward him. "You should be dead." "I was occupied." An increasingly familiar excuse. Titus stood beside the cot. For several moments neither spoke. The noise of distant repair servitors filled the compartment. Mataras finally said, "I remember you before the service studs, before Graia, before the Inquisition, before you had enough dead behind you to mistake them for a road." Titus did not answer. "The warrior I recruited would have hated the commander you have become. The warrior you recruited had never commanded a war in which hesitation killed worlds." Mataras's expression shifted, but not toward forgiveness. "That does not make every choice correct. No. And victory does not absolve the ones that were wrong. No." Mataras studied him for a long time. "Good." Titus turned toward the door. Behind him, the old warrior said, "Demetrian." Titus stopped. Mataras rarely used his given name. "Do not become so skilled at spending lives that you forget how expensive they are." Titus looked back once. "I have not forgotten." Mataras nodded, not because he believed the matter settled, but because there was nothing further to say. Gadriel found the second company standard 3 hours later. Armorers had recovered it from the tomb entrance after the survivors emerged, the shaft bent, the cloth torn almost in half. Green Necron residue stained one edge. Human blood darkened another. Several sections had burned away entirely, and a strip of fabric near the center still carried black particulate matter from the orbital bombardment at Calden. A serf offered to deliver the standard to the artificers for restoration. Gadriel refused. "Reinforce the torn edge. Clean nothing that will rot." The serf hesitated. "Ancient, the stains remain." Titus entered the armorium, while Gadriel inspected the damage. "A replacement standard can be issued," Titus said. Gadriel looked at him. It would not be the same standard. No. Gadriel ran one gauntleted hand across the scorched cloth. Then it would be a lie. Titus understood. The banner had survived the same war they had. Its damage was not imperfection to be erased, but history made physical. "Carry it as it is," he said. Gadriel inclined his head. "I intended to." Silver requested Titus on the bridge before fleet repairs were complete. The Commodore looked as though he had aged years since their arrival in the Reach. Behind him, the surviving Imperial ships appeared across the void display. Gaps in the formation marked vessels that would never return. "We have detected withdrawing Necron contacts beyond the outer system," Silver said. "Several are damaged. Their coordination has degraded since the convergence failed." Titus looked at the routes. "Pursuit capability? Possible. Not advisable." Silver expanded another display showing Mordain Prime and its moons. "If we pursue, we leave the surviving planets without sufficient fleet cover. If we remain, the Xenos escape. The choice would once have required no time. Amantar's possible survival would have been enough. Titus would have pushed outward, hunted the withdrawing vessels, and attempted to finish what had begun beneath Mordain. Now he looked at the planetary defense grid. Half the stations were gone. Surface batteries remained unreliable. Millions of wounded soldiers and civilians depended upon a fleet too damaged to protect them and chase the enemy simultaneously. Amantar had repeatedly tried to turn Titus's aggression into predictability. The Necrosaur had almost succeeded. "We remain," Titus said. Silver seemed to have expected another answer. "You are certain?" "Mordain was the objective. We do not abandon it to pursue an enemy that wants pursuit." The Commodore nodded slowly. "Defense posture, then. Until relief arrives." The evidence followed within the hour. Long-range augers intercepted faint bursts of destroyer-coded transmission beyond the system edge, too weak for translation, but consistent with the command structures previously associated with Amantar. No intact body had been recovered from the convergence chamber. The fragments torn from the Necrosaur during the dimensional collapse had either burned away or vanished under emergency translocation. The Tech Marines refused to certify destruction without a recoverable cranial core or confirmed annihilation of consciousness architecture. Titus required no optimism to interpret that. Amantar had lost the convergence. At least one Nightbringer shard had been forced back into containment, and the attempt to combine the fragments beneath Mordain had failed. But the Necrosaur's crusade had not ended. Somewhere beyond the system, something still transmitted with the cadence of destroyer command code. The dead machine had survived, or enough of it had survived to become dangerous again. Titus entered the conclusion into his report as enemy commander. Destruction, unconfirmed asterisk. Nothing more. His final transmission to the Ultramarian command hierarchy occupied less space than the casualty annex attached beneath it. Mordain Reach retained under Imperial authority. Primary convergence architecture destroyed. Nightbringer shard containment partially restored. Necron surface armies degraded and withdrawing. Enemy commander Amantar unconfirmed. Reclamation fleet severely depleted. Ground forces reduced below intended operational strength. Civilian and industrial losses catastrophic. He recorded no account of his duel. No mention of holding the Necrosaur inside the containment field. No description of the blood filling his armor while Gadriel activated the final control nexus. Those details were irrelevant to command. The final lines requested replacement bolt ammunition, plasma cells, armor components, Thunderhawk parts, gene seed recovery personnel, mortal infantry, naval crew replacements, and immediate strategic coordinates for the next contested world once the Reach could defend itself without the Second Company. Titus authorized the report and watched it vanish into the astropathic relay. The armorers worked on him last. His master-crafted chainsword lay across a steel bench beneath harsh lumen strips, its casing opened, broken teeth arranged beside it for replacement. Dried blood and necrodermis had been scraped from the housing,
though fragments remained inside the motor assembly. Tech Marines rebuilt sections of his battle plate around him, while he stood inside the armorium restraint frame. A new pauldron waited where Amantar had destroyed the old one. His breastplate required almost complete reconstruction. Beneath it, Apothecarian seals covered wounds not yet fully healed. Gadriel's damage standard hung nearby. Around them, servitors moved without rest. Victory had already become maintenance. Cornelius entered before the artificers finished sealing Titus's left vambrace. The astropath looked worse than before. New bandages covered his eyes. One hand trembled around his staff. Titus knew before he spoke. "Another signal," Cornelius said. "Origin? Deeper within the 500 worlds." An armorer stopped working. Titus did not. "Strength? Fragmentary distress traffic. Multiple Imperial sources. I cannot yet determine scale." Titus looked toward the casualty projection still open on the Armorium cogitator. Mordane's dead-filled column after column. Regiments destroyed, ships lost, cities condemned, millions unaccounted for. Another war waited beyond them, asking for survivors before the blood from this one had dried. "Captain," Gadriel said from the doorway, "your armor is not ready." Titus stepped from the restraint frame. "It will be." He lifted the damaged chainsword from the bench. Its motor had not yet been restored, but the weapon still possessed weight. "Notify Silver. Fleet elements capable of translation are to begin readiness rites. Remaining vessels stay under Mordane Defense Command. Second Company prepares for redeployment when replacement stores arrive." Cornelius gave a tired, bitter smile. "No celebration?" Titus looked through the Armorium viewport toward Mordane Prime. The planet rotated beneath them, half hidden by ash, its night side still burning. Somewhere below those clouds, soldiers dug new trenches through the graves of old ones. Administratum clerks counted the dead. Priests gave thanks for deliverance. Tech priests attempted to understand tomb machinery that might awaken again centuries after everyone presently alive had become dust. Mordane had survived. That was all. The war had not. In the Imperium of Man, those were two entirely different things.